ارحم لنا يا سيدنا محمد رسول الله ارحم لنا يا سيدنا.
الحمد لله حمد الشاكرين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد طب القلوب ودوائها ونور الأبصار وضيائها وعافية الأبدان وشفائها. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد كلما ذكرك الذاكرون وغفل عن ذكرك الغافلون. Today we intend to cover in a panoramic sense the entire book Islam Answers Atheism. Firstly, we start with the introduction and the dedication of the book. As mentioned, this book is dedicated to every Sancho Panza in the world. So a Sancho Panza, in effect, is anyone who retains a sense of reality, what we refer to as haqa'iq, understanding realities. And this is very important because in Sharh al-Aqaid, what do they mention? What does Sa'aduddin al-Taftazani rahimahullah ta'ala mention? حقائق الأشياء ثابتة. The realities of things is something established. So realities is something which a Muslim, a believer, is a Sancho Panza because he keeps the Don in check with reality. The Don, on the other hand, is someone who becomes misguided with his fantasies. He becomes lost in his fantasies, and Sancho Panza retains some sense of reality by giving admonitions, citations, and various wisdoms, what we refer to as hikam. So the dedication is to every Sancho Panza in the world. After passing through the contents page itself, you will notice that the headings are those headings which are very interesting. Those of the readers who are unable to read through the entire book, the best method of looking through the book would be to look through the contents page and then find something which interests them. When they look through the contents page, they may find something which intrigues them, like, for instance, the problem of evil and suffering on page 151, or when they see why does God need our worship, questions which people ask. Or for instance, maidens for men, what about women? Because people ask regarding the Hurul Ain, men have Hurul Ain in paradise, why do not women have the equivalent of Hurul Ain? Questions, common questions. So if people cannot go through the entire book, they can go through peruse through the contents page, find that which piques their interest, and then go straight to that passage and find what has been written in that regard. So this is why the content page is very important. The opening chapter has a quote, the opening introduction, has a quote from George Bernard Shaw, who once convened with Abdul Alim Siddiqui rahimallahu ta'ala, an old recording of a conversation with Al-Allama Abdul Alim Siddiqui rahimallahu ta'ala from the early 1900s, George Bernard Shaw. And a quote from him: "Beware of false knowledge, it is more dangerous than ignorance." So every chapter, and including the introduction, opens up with a quote which is appropriate for that chapter or for the theme of the chapter. And this, of course, opens up as an introduction with regard to new atheism. So new atheism, a distinction between new atheism and classical atheism. Classical atheism is as old as religion itself, where people denied the existence of God. And in Al-Quran Al-Kareem, throughout many verses, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs the believers with a response, how to respond to their arguments. That is classical atheism, updated, of course, in every century. And classical atheism had proponents like Bertrand Russell and others. But new atheism was a movement post 9/11. So the introduction opens up. And of course, many of the people attending today were not even born when the events of 9/11 happened. 9/11 is a reference to September the 11th, 2001, and the attacks on the trade centers in New York. So terrorist attacks on the trade center in New York, the towers, and the response to that, and especially the response to Islam and Muslims. One of the movements that initiated at that period was what became known as New Atheism. So you had the likes of Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett. These four initially, they wrote books in the early 2000s as a response to religion, including Christianity. And they made many claims regarding Islam, some of those claims unsubstantiated, in a tabloid fashion. So the way the tabloid newspapers will make headlines, the response of new atheists was no different, and a movement arose which became known as New Atheism. This culminated in a meeting which is referred to as the meeting of the Four Horsemen. The Four Horsemen is a reference to the book of Revelations in the New Testament, and the Four Horsemen which are mentioned in the book of Revelations. So the proponents of New Atheism, they were referred to as the Four Horsemen of Atheism. I mean, this was, of course, done to annoy the Christians. And in 2007, a meeting convened in the house of Christopher Hitchens in New York, in America, where they discussed religion, and this was the peak of the New Atheist movement. And then after 2010, up until Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins fell out, they continued in symposiums, in gatherings, attacking religion, making a mockery of religion, bringing fallacious arguments against religion. So this was the New Atheist movement. So the book starts with a reference to that, but one important passage at the beginning, which is, reader welcome, I urge you to read this book in its entirety. Do not judge this book until you have read it all. A book does not reveal everything until you have read it completely. You will not completely appreciate it until you read all of its chapters, like the tesserae in a mosaic. Whenever you think something has not been answered, or a point not clarified, you will find the answer and clarification further down or in another chapter where that point will be more relevant. This is very important because people now, they do not have stamina to finish a book. They have become so addicted to smartphones and entertainment that if they need to sit in a corner and read a book, they will find this difficult, a task more difficult than jogging around the block. If you told someone to jog around the block, they will find that difficult because of unhealthy diets and unhealthy lifestyles. But likewise, to read a book, a person needs stamina. So I placed this paragraph at the beginning in order to encourage people to read a book. Meaning people need to read a book or two once in a while. And this is a type of book which is very essential. So the opening passage is in order to encourage people to read the entire book. What also is mentioned is this book is the result of engagements with a vociferous and provocative collection of people. One could almost say a faction called the New Atheists. In addresses at universities, mosques, churches, public areas, as well as in private homes and informal gatherings. New Atheism is on a crusade, a holy war, to dethrone its preconceived ideas of God and indeed all religions. So preconceived ideas, because they have many, as I mentioned, fallacious conceptions of God, preconceived ideas of God, which are utilized in order to place doubt in the hearts of believers, in order to make people leave the fold of Islam or any religion at all. So this book will show how these new atheist arguments use fallacy, straw man arguments, emotional content, and that's very important, emotional content, because the emotional content, the problem of evil, which is covered in chapter 4, is entirely based on emotional content. And peculiar invective to disparage and denigrate. The book aims in particular to counter the propaganda peddled and perpetuated against Islam. So after this, the mention of the Twin Tower attacks, and with regard to propaganda, there is a famous book written by one of the relatives of Sigmund Freud, known as Propaganda, a book written in the 1930s. If you read that book, you will learn with regard to propaganda, written before the Third Reich. So before Hitler, propaganda was a systematic approach in programming populations to a way of thinking, programming. What we have today in the modern media, programming people to think in a particular way. So there is a reference to the Third Reich here. They wrote, in fact, a book on propaganda, and a quote is mentioned here: propaganda has no principles of its own. It has only one goal. And in politics, that goal is always to conquer the masses. Any means to that end is good, and any means that does not serve that end is bad. So the propaganda that we have today, the war in Palestine being a pertinent example today, but so many different issues, propaganda with regard to socio-economic decline or capitalism, the effects of capitalism on migrant communities and working class people, division, making divisions amongst various classes of people, that they concentrate on one another and avoid the bourgeois, the ruling class. The criticism should be for the bourgeois, the ruling class, the ruling elite, but yet the classes are divided amongst themselves. This is all a result of propaganda. So propaganda is a powerful tool. How propaganda is employed, and propaganda is employed in the field of religion to tarnish Islam especially. So the following passage sums up all of New Atheism. The entire polemical argument against Islam is encapsulated in the following exaggerated vitriol. So the following will sum up the entire argument against Islam, the propaganda regarding Islam. That is what a superstitious, Jew-hating, violent religion that kills innocents, enslaves free people, that has a totalitarian, homophobic, misogynistic law that oppresses women and uses draconian punishments like amputation and stoning. This encapsulates everything said regarding Islam. This entire passage, that what is the propaganda regarding Islam today is encapsulated in this paragraph. So a sentiment especially echoed by Richard Dawkins, who unabashedly tweeted, now this is Richard Dawkins, a well-known professor, doesn't need an introduction, a biologist or a zoologist, who I refer to as an antiquated fossil, an outdated fossil, a person who is out of touch, a person who represents post-colonialism. He writes, haven't read Quran. Note, he writes Quran with a K. Haven't read Quran, so couldn't quote chapter and verse like I can for Bible, but often say, Islam greatest force for evil today. This sums up what they say regarding Islam. That the man admits he has never read the Quran, he writes Quran in the old Orientalist style, Quran with a K, admits he has never read the Quran, but still asserts that Islam is the greatest force for evil today. So this encapsulates everything what the book is refuting. And it also covers what is a part of the propaganda which is inculcated in the minds of young people in the RS classes, religious studies, in GCSEs, A-levels, in university, people who enroll into Abrahamic faiths and philosophy, people enroll into theology. They come across these arguments. But many of them will be unfamiliar on how to counteract those arguments. So the introduction is my counter to just some of the propaganda. I mentioned throughout the introduction how through Victorian times you had the likes of Prime Minister Gladstone, who I think was Prime Minister 5 times of the UK in the time of Queen Victoria, and his statements with regard to Islam. Gladstonian politics continued with the likes of David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Britain during World War I. David Lloyd George was Prime Minister during World War I, and he was instrumental in dismantling the Ottoman Caliphate. And the policies that were carried out by the Foreign Office in that time, because you must remember, Britain is ambiguous in its policies. How ambiguous? Britain is a capitalist state, in fact, one of the oldest capitalist states in the world. And as a capitalist nation, Britain must preserve its capitalist goals. And capitalism has no borders, in fact. So, like capitalism has no borders, capitalism always watches out for the interests of capitalism or the capitalist people, the ruling elite, the City of London, and meaning from the 32 or so boroughs of London, there is one borough known as the City of London, which controls all capital within the UK. And from the time of King John, the king or the queen pays homage to the City of London, because the City of London generates wealth, and the wealth then funds the armies. So over 1 million troops were placed out during World War I across the Middle East and across Europe in order to fight Germany. But one of the main goals, as mentioned by David Lloyd George, who was a Christian Zionist, was to dismantle the caliphate. This was one of the main achievements of the British Empire at that point. Now, why I say it's an ambiguous goal, because we can use the word poly, meaning the politics of Britain changes so many times in accordance with what falls into what we refer to as maqasid, or what we refer to as aghrad, their own personal motives, which can change from time to time. what benefits the nation. So today, if it benefits the nation to re-establish a caliphate, Britain's policy would be pro-Islam. So this nation, meaning we are a part of this nation, changes its policies in accordance with what is conducive to capitalism. So Gladstonian politics is a reference to Gladstone, who had a very anti-Islamic sentiment, and this was carried out in the cabinet, the war cabinet, in World War I, the war cabinet from 1914 to 1918. Some of them were influenced heavily by Gladstonian politics, and therefore that influenced foreign policy. And that foreign policy was very anti-Islam. So from post 9/11, there was an anti-Islamic policy, war policy. So in post World War I, the policies were against Islam by using Christian and Zionist rhetoric. But post 9/11, it is atheist Zionist rhetoric. So in 100 years, you've had the change of rhetoric because, as I mentioned, the nation is ambiguous. It changes. So they can change from Christianity to atheism and very easily move from atheism to Islam if it falls into the interests of the capitalist elite. But the policies changed in promulgating amongst the masses atheism, make people atheists, in order that Islam loses its political dynamics. Islam has a political system, so which is covered in chapter 6. So this is the political motivation of new atheism. New atheism has a political motive. So there is politics behind the promotion of atheism amongst Muslims. So in previous times, when the colonialists, they would go out to India, they would propagate Christianity in order to disarm the Indian population of Islam, because Islam is an effective political tool. Aside from being a theology, it has the Quran, the longest verse in the Quran is regarding trade. In Surah Al-Baqarah, the longest verse is regarding trade. The Quran has over 500 verses on governance, explicit verses on governance, 500. The Quran has a foreign policy. The Quran has a code of governance. The Quran has ordinances. The Quran has a penal code. The Quran has economic laws which counteract capitalism. So therefore, the Quran needs to be refuted by new atheism. So this political movement started post 9/11. So there are references to Gladstonian politics in the introduction also. There is also a reference to Sam Harris and his racist attitude, as well as the misogynistic behavior of the new atheists. So Lawrence Krauss, who wrote the book, a book which is refuted in chapter 3, a universe from nothing. So the book is mentioned in chapter 3. Lawrence Krauss was removed or resigned, forced to resign from his post in Arizona University because of sexual misconduct with women. So there are claims made regarding Islam that Islam is misogynistic, but you have leading figures of new atheism who have gross misconduct in their ethical and moral behavior. When the same claims are made with regard to priests or with regard to clerics or with regard to religious clergy, those claims are made with vitriol, with a hatred. But when the new atheists carry out the similar behavior, if not worse, the reaction of the new atheists tends to be different. There is also a reference to the link between Richard Dawkins and Epstein. So Epstein, who died in a New York jail, was known for his sexual misconduct and also his links with Prince Andrew. Epstein had a link with Richard Dawkins. And of course, there is a link, and Richard Dawkins may now dismiss that association. But if there was a religious person who had such a similar type of link, the attitude and response, the belligerent language utilized against Muslims or atheists in general is not utilized with regard to fellow atheists. This is something important to point out. So there are also horrific references to the tweets of Richard Dawkins, where he mentions that there is no difference between a human fetus and a pig, for instance. There is a reference to that where he says, with respect to those meanings of human that are relevant to the morality of abortion, any fetus is less human than an adult pig. So atheists, of course, should have no morality, because there is no moral ethics or code of conduct if there is no God. They claim there is. But in reality, if there is no God, there should be no reason why a human being should be ethical. So abortions are permitted, or in fact, many of them campaign for the legalization of abortions. In Islam, there is a code. Abortion is permitted in certain circumstances only. But in Christianity, mainstream Christianity, abortion is totally impermissible. In Islam, it's permitted in certain circumstances, like blood transfusion is also permitted. But for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, they do not permit even blood transfusion. But atheists, when they respond to those type of religious groups, they would say that there is no ethical reason for abortions being impermissible. But Richard Dawkins, he tweets by saying that there is no difference between a human fetus and a pig, biologically speaking. This is the result of atheism. Likewise, in the same introduction, there is a reference to Gladstone and his statements with regard to the Quran. And there is also references to the war on terror, meaning a war on a noun. Have you ever heard of a war on a noun? The war on terror. But it in fact was a war on human beings. A war on human beings. The war on terror was not a war on a noun. It was a war on human beings. So post 9/11, as a result of the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, millions of people died. Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who is a major figure in the New Atheist movement, he was a proponent of the war in Iraq. So do not think that New Atheism is a humanistic movement that cares for humanity, cares for Muslims, cares for natives of various countries, cares for indigenous peoples of various countries. No. The fact is that New Atheism is a violent ideology, a violent anti-theism that cropped up post 9/11. So moving on to chapter 1. So this is some of the aspects mentioned in the introduction. Moving on to chapter 1. Firstly, a summary of each chapter. Chapter 1 is an overview of the role of reason in the Islamic faith, the Qur'an's encouragement of rationale and condemnation of blind faith, before looking at the early development of rational theology and the Kalam science, the dialectical method used against heresy and including atheism. So chapter 1 is regarding the role of reason how Islam condemns blind faith, how the Quran condemns blind faith, and also a science known as Ilmul Kalam, the science of theology or rational theology, how this developed over the centuries and how it refuted various heresies, including the heresy of atheism. Chapter 2 is an excursion into the epistemology of the Kalam methodology to derive knowledge and arrive at certainty regarding any given fact. The chapter also delves into common material fallacies and a summary of other philosophies which are in contradistinction to Islam and subscribed to by many atheists knowingly or unknowingly. So chapter 1 is an overview of the fact that blind faith is impermissible in Islam, while chapter 2 looks at epistemology. How do we approach knowledge? How do we attain knowledge regarding facts? And a distinction between Islamic epistemology and modern philosophies and the epistemology that they adopt, a contradistinction between the two, how the two are diametrically opposed to one another, and which of the two, of course, is more rational. Is Islam's method in attaining knowledge more rational, or is the method of various other philosophies more rational? Chapter 3 starts by unraveling some skepticism with specific reference to David Hume. Skepticism is doubt, meaning if a person has a flawed epistemology or an epistemology which inculcates doubt, the resultant of their investigations will always be skepticism, whether this skepticism is a mitigated skepticism or a total skepticism like the solipsism of the Greeks and various other forms of skepticism. With specific reference to David Hume and earlier Hellenistic philosophy, then it moves to the specific proofs for God. This chapter concludes by considering the innumerable signposts to God, anything from Fibonacci numbers to a snowflake. Even though I don't mention Fibonacci numbers in the chapter, I made a reference to it in the introduction. Chapter 4 delves into the problem of evil, human free will, and other deep philosophical objections to God. Of special interest is an in-depth analysis of Stephen Fry's controversial interview regarding God and evil. So this is a reference to Stephen Fry, the famous comedian. He had an interview in Ireland, and in that interview made a mockery of God and objected to God via the problem of evil. So the entire chapter is in fact a response to Stephen Fry. And the book was sent to him also first class and delivered. Chapter 5 is a response to the claims made regarding Islam's position on science and scientific objections against the Quran and Hadith, concluding with a rational approach to the hotly contested topic on evolution theory. So chapter 5 responds to scientific objections on the Quran. So many people, they go onto these popular videos made by former Muslims or atheists where they claim that there are scientific errors in the Quran, or they will claim that there are scientific errors in the Hadith, or the Hadith contradicts science. So chapter 5 is a response to those claims. Many of those claims are covered. In fact, the method is given also. So this is why chapter 2 is important. Why is chapter 2 important? Because chapter 2 teaches us how to approach the subject. So anyone who masters chapter 2 will be able to do it himself or herself. They will be able to counter the arguments by using their own mind. This is the importance of chapter 2, which is the chapter on epistemology. Chapter 6 looks at the historicity of the Quran, Hadith, and most widely debated subjects surrounding Sharia, law like jihad, slavery, punishments, and human rights. Chapter 6 again is with regard to preservation of the Quran. How do we know the Quran was preserved? How do we know the hadith were preserved? And then the objections to Sharia law, which are the most common arguments. Sometimes atheists will skip all of these discussions and move straight to Sharia law. So they will say to you in a discussion, why does Islam permit 4 marriages for a man? Why does Islam have jihad, holy war? Why does Islam have amputation of the hands for theft? Why does Islam have stoning for adultery? So how will a person respond to this? Of course, the correct method is going through the epistemology, going through the method of being able to respond to such claims. So the chapter 1 opens with the statement of Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu, who is Babu Madinatul Ilm, the door of the city of knowledge. Ana Madinatul Ilmi wa Aliyun Babuha. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, I am the city of knowledge, and Ali radiallahu anhu is the door to the city of knowledge. So it was more appropriate to start the first chapter with a citation from Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Of course, there are other references to Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu in chapter 1 also, and also the other companions alayhimu ridwan. But the chapter starts with the quote, there is no illness more debilitating than the lack of intellect. So the role of intellect in Islam. Intellect plays a major role, and the common fallacy is that Islam does not permit people to use their minds. This is a fallacy. The very Quran starts with فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, meaning mentions فَعْلَمْ, know that there is no deity, only Allah. So فَعْلَمْ, which is an imperative, is based on the command to know. So the chapter starts with this. And also what is mentioned on the first page of the chapter is that many of the arguments of New Atheism are actually outdated arguments, repackaged. So outdated arguments which were debated in Baghdad, in cities of knowledge, amongst Muslims and amongst heretical sects. So in the first 200 years or 300 years of Islam, after the founding of Baghdad, Baghdad was founded by the Abbasis. So there was no Baghdad prior to the Abbasi Caliphate. But prior to that, in various cities like Al-Kufa and Al-Basra, but then later in Baghdad, and Baghdad was founded 130 years after the Hijrah, the migration of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In those cities, in the mosques, they would have circles of knowledge. In those circles of knowledge, a scholar would sit down, teach sarf, morphology, Arabic morphology, or nahaw, Arabic syntax, or rhetoric, or hadith, and some of them would teach doctrine, aqidah, belief. And because of the translation of various books, those books entered Baghdad. Initially, the books were in Greek. So the Muslims, they adopted all the Greek philosophy, and one of the caliphs commanded some of the proficient translators to translate those Greek documents into Arabic. So Greek philosophy entered the Arab world, or the Muslim civilization. Because the civilization, even though in the early period composed of Arab rulers who were the caliphs, the civilization itself was Persian, Arabic, African, a mix, even European. There were many European Muslims who had entered the fold of Islam, and the civilization was a mix, meaning a good example of real, what they refer to today as multiculturalism. Real multiculturalism was found in Islam. So in this period, they debated in the mosques, so many debates. So the arguments utilized by new atheists are in fact outdated arguments. So I make a reference to some of the philosophers, modern or pre-modern philosophers, pre-modern, the likes of David Hume. Some of the arguments that they utilize are in fact mentioned in the books of Kalam, Ilmul Kalam, which is rational theology. So on page 14, where I mentioned the prime importance of Kalam. What is Kalam? Kalam is a tool utilized by Muslims in order to counter rational arguments against Islam. So if someone is stating that they are making a rational argument, Kalam is a tool which counters that rational argument, and was a tool that was utilized in the early period. There are some people now who object to Kalam, claiming that Kalam is impermissible because some of the earlier scholars, as-Salafus Salihun, they prohibited Kalam. Like Al-Imam Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i, rahimallahu ta'ala, who said, "Hukmi fi ahli al-kalam," that my judgment regarding the people of Kalam is that they be lashed, and various similar types of statements. The response to that is that Al-Imam al-Shafi'i rahimallahu ta'ala was stating this with regard to the impermissible kalam in the early formative years, when ilmul kalam had not developed, but kalam, when expressed unrestrictedly, was in reference to the Mu'tazili sect. Was a reference to the Mu'tazili sect, who would utilize ilmul kalam for heretical arguments. So the early condemnation of kalam was in reference to the heretical sects that utilized fallacies in order to argue against Islam. But ilmul kalam, as Ibn Asakir, the famous historian and hadith scholar, Damascene scholar, he points out that ilmul kalam, as developed by Sunni theologians, was a valid tool, a valid science, which was utilized to counteract any arguments. And this was the valid kalam, the type which Al-Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimallahu ta'ala utilized to counter the Greek philosophers and the scientists of his time, who attempted to assault the very religious doctrines of Islam. So it's important to understand what is meant by ilmul kalam. Is rational discourse and rational discussions encouraged by the Quran? There is a citation of some of the verses of Al-Quran al-Kareem, which I mentioned on page 15. There is a reference to the verse in Surah Al-Isra, لا تقف ما ليس لك به علم إن السمع والبصر والفؤاد كل أولئك كان عنه مسؤولا, which is translated as, do not follow that which you have no knowledge of, because surely the hearing, sight and heart will be questioned regarding that, in Al-Quran al-Kareem. So the Quran encourages people to seek knowledge with regard to what they have learned and what they believe. Ilmul kalam and refuting deviancy or refuting heresy is an obligation on the ulama. If they do not fulfill this obligation, they become sinful, because many of the Muslims fall into doubt when they are exposed to arguments against Islam. Many of the common people will fall into doubt. So I mention anecdotes with this in this regard. For instance, it is related that Ustad Abu Bakr al-Furaq, This is one of the early theologians, early Kalam scholars. After having studied the proofs of religion for years, decided to retire to worship in isolation. While in seclusion, he heard someone call out to him, "Having become a proof of Allah for the creation, yet you choose to run away from the very creation." On hearing this, Ustad Abu Bakr abandoned his retirement and went back to teaching. Meaning it's a fard, an obligation on the ulama to teach the people the counter arguments that are made by the detractors of Islam. The arguments that are made against Islam, the ulama must teach the people how to counter those arguments. There is another anecdote which is mentioned, which you can read for yourself. Then I mentioned the categories of belief. Beliefs, there are those beliefs which we know solely from the intellect. Like we know from the intellect the existence of Allah, and we know many of His attributes solely from the intellect alone. Like we know Allah is all powerful from the intellect alone. Then there are those beliefs which rely upon the scripture alone, like the belief in angels. There are certain things we only know from the scripture, from the Quran and Hadith. And then there is a third category that we know both from the intellect and from scripture. But even belief in scripture, a person must believe in God in the first place in order to believe in a divine revelation. So this categorization of belief is mentioned. Then there are degrees of proof. Degrees of proof. That some things may impart certainty, and some things may impart near certainty, and some things impart doubt, and some things impart uncertainty, where a person must make a choice between one of the two. When we refer to belief in Allah, which type do we mean? We mean absolute certainty. A person must have absolute certainty with regard to the existence of Allah Almighty. So this is with regard to degrees of certainty, and also this differs from people to people, from person to person. And I mentioned the anecdote of an old woman in the village. She is asked with regard to her faith, and she believes in one God. But why does she believe in one God? She has her own proof. The proof is what? I write on page 18, likewise an old woman in a village was asked the same question while she was cooking meat broth in a large cauldron. Meaning, which question? Why do you believe in a God? She responded by saying that when she cooks and stirs the broth, if she stops stirring, the contents remain still, and the broth only moves when she stirs. So when she observes the sunrise and the sunset, and the various positions of the sun throughout the day and during the seasons, the moon waxing and waning throughout the month, and the constellations changing with the regularity every 3 months in the hemisphere, she knows with certainty that someone is moving all these celestial bodies the way she moves her broth, and if there were not, nothing would be moving. When further asked whether that God could be one God and not two or multiple gods, she responded by saying, so I carry on with the anecdote. But the point of the story is that this proof is sufficient for that old woman. And this is how levels of proof differ. For some people, this is sufficient to believe in God. But those who are philosophically trained or scientifically trained would need a philosophical response or a scientific response, depending on their specialty, depending on their field. So for the layperson, these type of proofs are sufficient. But if people are exposed to sophisticated argumentation against Islam, it becomes an obligation to counter those arguments. And this is the role of ilmul kalam. This is where ilmul kalam enters the field with its armory, its artillery, meaning intellectual artillery, intellectual armory, in order to counter those arguments. So, the story of Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi is also mentioned on page 19. That it is related that once Al-Imam al-Razi was walking through a crowd of people attempting to meet him because of his great fame. An old woman was passing and inquired as to what was happening. She was told that the man the crowd was greeting was none other than the renowned Kalam specialist and legal theorist Imam al-Razi, who had over 100 different proofs for the existence of God. She responded by saying 100 proofs for 100 doubts. At first sight, this may seem to be a rebuke of the great al-Razi, but in reality it is rebuking those for whom Imam al-Razi had formulated those arguments in order to remove their doubts. So the old woman was satisfied with basic proofs. But Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi had formulated over 100 proofs for the more sophisticated minds or the educated minds, what people refer to as the enlightened minds. But in reality, the old woman can be more enlightened than even those people we deem as being sophisticated. Because sometimes, for instance, knowing that the human fetus is more precious than an adult pig is common sense, intuitively known to many human beings. But we would have the sophisticated Richard Dawkins thinking otherwise. So this shows that even those people deemed as uneducated, illiterate, unenlightened, they will be more enlightened with regard to those things which are intuitively known from our human fitrah, natural disposition. But yet those who deem themselves as being educated, enlightened, or we could say in one sense programmed, they will have such statements or have such conceptions that go against basic humanity, like the statement with regard to the fetus. So, certitude in faith varies through though, and a person can easily fall into one of the following three categories. So 3 categories of certainty. A person's faith is doubtful or uncertain. Then that faith is rendered invalid and the person is categorized as an unbeliever. A person who has doubt. A person outwardly professes faith, yet inwardly does not believe. Then that faith is also rendered invalid and the person is categorized as a hypocrite. So a person who pretends to be a Muslim, but inwardly they do not believe or they are doubtful. The third, a person has certainty in faith, but yet does not acquire at least the general summary proofs by which he can safeguard his faith and remove doubts. Then while that faith is acceptable, the person is nevertheless deemed a sinner. Some theologians deem such a person as an unbeliever, even though outwardly he may be treated as a Muslim. So this is someone who has faith but does not acquire at least the general summary of proofs. A person who is staunch on his faith but does not acquire even a general summary. These are the people who sometimes may become zealous, resort to book burning or violence in order to safeguard their own faith. Why? When they cannot articulate a rational argument, they cannot articulate a rational theological response to arguments against their religion, in order to cover self-doubt, in order to cover their own inner doubts, they resort to violence and zealotry. Therefore, teaching people rational theology is a must in this day and age, that we teach them how to respond to those things which they believe are an attack, an assault on their faith. So blind conformity is covered after this on page 20. That blind conformity is totally prohibited in Islam with regard to belief, aqaid. So when you read statements which condemn blind conformity, those statements are in actual fact condemning blind conformity in belief. What do we mean by taqleed? Taqleed, blind following in fiqh. When people say they do taqleed of the 4 schools, this in fact refers to legal rulings which comprise of 20% of the legal rulings. And people do taqleed of one of the imams. It does not mean blind conformity in faith or those aspects of fiqh which are known to every Muslim. Like we know alcohol is prohibited. You do not need to be a muqallid, a person who is blind following, in order to know the basic that alcohol is prohibited in Islam. So taqleed is a reference to blind conformity in 20% of legal rulings which are obscure legal rulings. But there is no blind conformity in aqeedah, and this is what many Salafis, they confuse, because when they condemn Sunni Muslims for blind conforming the 4 imams, what they fail to mention is that blind conformity carried out by Sunni Muslims is in reference to 20% of legal rulings found in the 4 schools. It's not a reference to belief. It's prohibited, according to Sunni Muslims, to blind follow. Blind follow here means a blind conformity to people alive today with regard to faith. But if someone says, I believe because I believe Sayyiduna Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was truthful and that's it, that is not deemed as blind conformity. If someone says, I believe whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told me, that's fine, because he believes in the truthfulness of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But if he says, I believe because my parents are believers, or I believe because of society, this is considered blind faith. So such a person would be deemed as sinful. And certain ulama, scholars, deemed him as a disbeliever, even though the correct position is such a person is sinful. The questions and answers is at the end, inshallah. So write down your questions, and any questions you have, place them on a paper and then send them to the front. What was your question? So when a person reaches the age of taklif, so this is covered, as I mentioned in my book at the beginning, that any question you believe has been left unanswered, you read through the book, you will find the question answered. Your question's answered in the book. So as we go continue, you will find your question answered. Under the point of taklif, taklif is what? Legal obligation. When does a person become legally obligated? So your question will be answered further down. The next part, which is 1.6 on page 22, is with regard to the intuitive mind of the pious predecessors. What does this mean? This means that the pious predecessors possessed an intellect that they were able to answer questions intuitively, that today we would deem those questions as being theoretically difficult. So there are examples, anecdotes which are mentioned of Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, where Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anhu, for instance, it is mentioned, was standing to deliver a sermon when a man stood up and asked a question regarding inheritance laws, which for anyone else would have taken contemplation and calculation. The Caliph Ali radiallahu anhu answered immediately without such a need. Those who were present in the audience were astounded at his brilliance. This particular question on inheritance laws became known as the pulpit questions in the books of jurisprudence. This is in reference to a story that Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu was standing on the pulpit. A man came in to ask a question on inheritance laws. The question became known as Mas'alatul Mimbariya, the pulpit question. And in fact, it's a difficult question, but impromptu, intuitively, Al-Imam Ali radiallahu anhu responded to his question and answered straight away. So there are a few anecdotes mentioned. This is referenced as note number 18. By the way, there is a glossary of terms at the end also. And if many of you remember, a few years ago, I promised to deliver a glossary of terms for Muslims on theism and atheism. That glossary of terms is now delivered in the back of the book. So at the back of the book, from page 363, you have a glossary of terms. So the glossary of terms includes philosophical terms, kalam terminology, hadith terminology, scientific terms also. So anything which is technical is covered in the glossary at the back. And the note for this particular anecdote is note number 18. So note number 18 gives us the details of this pulpit question, where it states the pulpit question, al-mas'alatul mimbariya, a man dies leaving two daughters, a wife and his mother and father. In this case, the two daughters receive 2/3 and the wife receives 1/8, while the parents receive 1/6 each. When the man stood up and asked this question suddenly, the Caliph Ali radiallahu anhu responded straight away with the shares and said, make the division of the estate by... Straight away he responded. He said what? Make the division of the estate. This is on page 355, note 18. Make the division of the estate by 27 shares, which are 16 for the two daughters, 8 portions each, and 3 portions for the wife, and 8 portions for the parents, which are divided as 4 for the mother and 4 for the father. He gave this answer straight away. The intuitive mind of the Salaf. Why is this mentioned? There are other stories mentioned also, in order to tell us that the early generations did not need formalization of many of the Islamic sciences. So, for instance, ilmun nahaw, which is grammar, Arabic grammar. The companions of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew Arabic grammar intuitively. They did not need to write down the laws of grammar. But when people misspoke Arabic incorrectly, they would say things. Sayyiduna Ali radiallahu anh commanded Abu al-Aswad to write down the basic rules of grammar. This was the inception of Arabic grammar. Likewise, ilmul kalam, the rational method of argumentation, the pious predecessors did not need to write down the rational method because many of the arguments they could answer, they could respond to intuitively. But then the later generations felt the need to write down the methodology of ilmul kalam. This is the purpose of this section. Section 1.7, the mind and the intellect, is with regard to the praise of the intellect, that the intellect is praised in the Quran and the Sunnah. There is an anecdote mentioned here, in fact, an authentic hadith. This is an authentic hadith which is referenced also toward the end, again on note 21. Al-Imam al-Bayhaqi narrates in Al-I'tiqad that Sayyiduna Umar radiallahu an, Caliph Umar radiallahu an, in a conversation with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was extolling the afterlife, the horrors of the grave, and the having to face the two angels in that grave who dispense punishment to the unbelievers, at that point the Caliph radiallahu an asked, will my mental faculties be intact at that time? The mind. To which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, yes. And the Caliph Umar radiallahu anh said, I should be able to handle their questioning then. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam responded with, Umar is certain and truthful. What does this tell us? The role of the intellect. The role of the intellect. That Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, he inquired with regard to the intellect, meaning the prime importance of the intellect, that even the questioning of al-munkar and al-nakir, a person can respond to al-munkar and al-nakir by utilizing his intellect. So this is an example that is mentioned in this section with regard to the importance of the intellect. The next part, 1.8, is religious hypocrisy. Religious hypocrisy is in reference to those people who tarnish the name of religion. Who tarnish the name of religion. So people who may ostensibly appear religious, meaning you cannot define religiosity by appearance. A person may have a long beard, but honesty in trade and commerce will be at a loss, meaning when you deal with him in trade and commerce, he's a liar. Another person may have a short beard or no beard at all, but is very honest in trade and commerce. So religiosity, people who have an ostensible religious appearance, or what people deem as religiosity in garment, clothing, but they will be hypocritical in their belief. This is a reference to belief, that outwardly a person may deem himself or make the pretensions of being a believer, but inwardly a disbeliever. So I make reference to Roald Dahl at this point also, and Bertrand Russell. So Bertrand Russell, famous philosopher, Bertrand Russell mentions that such types in his frank and honest autobiography. So he has a 3-volume autobiography recounting horrific things that a priest he knew did in his formative years. He concludes by saying that some of the greatest evil on earth has been perpetrated by religious people. Roald Dahl, the children's writer, also claims in Boy Tales of Childhood that the beatings he received from supposedly religious people, meaning the headmaster in his school, during his childhood led him to disbelieve in God. This is why I believe atheism is also a psychological problem, that people who are abused by religious hypocrites are mentally affected in their formative years, that it leads them to reject God, reject religion. So people who are abused in madrasas in Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, the madrasas are not correctly regulated. So but it's a systematic failure, because abuse in those places is not limited to the madrasas. There is an institutional failing, that children may be abused throughout various institutions, like we had here in the UK, institutional failings with the BBC, with abuse cases within the BBC, Jimmy Savile, or abuse cases in care homes, abuse cases with Prince Andrew, abuse cases in Hollywood, abuse cases in schools and colleges, abuse cases in the Premier League, abuse cases within the clergy. So likewise, there were institutional failings within the UK, but in America, in the US and other places, in France today, abuse from government, meaning government officials, and in Italy, but also in Pakistan, institutional failings in the madrasa that young children may be abused. Some of those young children in their formative years may begin to disbelieve in God. So this passage is a reference to religious hypocrisy, because we can condemn people from the secular institutes, but the first condemnation must be with regard to those who are in charge, who have authority in religious institutes. So this section covers religious hypocrisy. People who outwardly may be Muslim, but inwardly disbelievers. And they may be those people who display zealotry and religious extremism also in order to cover up their own doubts, internal doubts. Section 1.9 on page 28. Salvation through Kalam. So this section covers why Kalam has a prime importance in covering in counteracting rational arguments. That in order to counteract rational arguments, sometimes some people present fallacious arguments and they say these arguments are intellectual or rational, but there is no real definition of what is actually rational. They never mention how do you define rationality. How do you define an intellectual argument? What is your epistemology? What is your method of defining an argument? They will have none. They will only have emotional argumentation. So a person who will deny a miracle, for instance, he will state that I do not believe in this miracle. Why do you not believe in this miracle? Because it sounds irrational. What do you mean by rationality? How do you define what is rational and irrational? They will be unable to do so. And they cannot demonstrate. As I will show in chapter 2, that has adequately been done in chapter 2. So 1.9 is with regard to the prime importance of Ilmul Kalam, and also a reference to cults and cult blind following and miracle making and superstition. So I mention, in reality, such people who are ignorant of the rational basis of belief in God are prone to claiming miracle making, superstition, imagination of visions in a wakeful state and dreams, and other elements of misguidance. Some Eastern mystics claim that if the body is freed from its material desires, then a person can reach enlightenment. But does this enlightenment conform to a knowledge that does not contradict the rational mind? If it does contradict rational thought, then it is not enlightenment, but rather a satanic delusion or a delusion of the ego. Anyone who rushes into spiritual practice without attaining the requisite knowledge first is in fact largely following a hidden desire, such as in many of the New Age groups or Eastern mystical groups. This is on page 30, by the way. Or deviated Sufi cults, where that desire could be love of leadership, wealth, fame, notoriety, or even a desire for miracles. In fact, traditional Sufis, so I have to place the disclaimer, real authentic Sufism. Traditional Sufis warned against such people. Authentic early Sufi masters would first teach the adept rational proof for the existence of God and His divine attributes. One of the earliest and reliable books, Al-Qushayri's epistle, Ar-Risalat al-Qushayriya, starts with an elaboration of rational theology. So after this I mentioned that even authentic Sufis, they warn against such type of cult. So much of the inauthentic Sufism that we observe today is as a result of not teaching the adept rational arguments for God or the Quran and Sunnah. So what I mean by this, a person affiliates with a sheikh or a group, he must at least teach him either verses of the Quran and Hadith. And if the person is not satisfied with verses of the Quran and Hadith, then teach him rational arguments for the existence of God. Both of these. But if they are not learning the rational arguments for the existence of God, and they are not learning Quran and Sunnah, there is something missing. So if someone just learns Quran and Sunnah, it is perfectly fine. But if they are exposed to rational arguments against Islam, then they must learn also the rational arguments also. It's important that they learn both. Then in 1.10 on page 31, I mentioned the emergence of dispute. That why did dispute arise? So some history of early disputes amongst the Muslims, that when the disputes arose, then people needed rational arguments to counter those the disputes, counteract those disputes. On page 33, I mentioned the Mu'tazila sect. So the Mu'tazila sect was seen as the most rational sect. In fact, they have many admirers amongst those who believe these traditional Sunnis believe in irrational things. They have many admirers amongst non-Muslims and even Muslims who adopt Mu'tazili positions. So in section 1.11, I cover the Mu'tazili sect and the background of the Mu'tazili sect, who they were and the development of the Mu'tazili sect, and how Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahimahullah ta'ala, how he left the Mu'tazili sect. So the story of Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari is mentioned. I state, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was a Mu'tazili disciple until he reached the age of 40. A student of the Mu'tazili philosopher Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. He too held the position that God must do for an individual. This is on page 35. God must do for an individual what is beneficial for that individual, and that it was an obligation on God to do so. So this was a Mu'tazili premise, a proposition. They said God must do what is beneficial for us. So what happened? The traditional Sunni view, on the other hand, was that God was not obliged to do good or bad for the individual and did whatever He willed. The Mu'tazila's view avoided difficult questions like why God created evil or whether humans created their own actions. And thus, to avoid getting stuck, they would, unlike the Sunni, readily reformulate their creed. Do you understand this? At every point, every juncture, when they would face difficult questions, the Mu'tazila would reformulate their creed, while the Sunnis had rational arguments ready. This is why for people to prefer the Mu'tazili method, this is flawed, because if they prefer the Mu'tazili method, they would reformulate their creed every week. When they come across arguments that they cannot rationally respond to. While the Sunnis, they had rational arguments ready against every objection against the Quran and the Hadith. One day Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari asked his teacher Abu Ali al-Jubai, "What do you say regarding three brothers, one of whom died obedient, another disobedient, and the third who died young?" Remember, what did the Mu'tazila say? Allah must do what is better for the person. Ali al-Jubai replied, the first will be rewarded in paradise, the second will be punished in hell, and the third will not be punished. Al-Ash'ari further inquired, what if the third, the one who died young, asked God why he made him die young, not keeping him alive so that he might have the chance to obey and thus enter paradise? How would God respond? Al-Jubai replied, God would say that he knew the boy would grow up to disobey me, and thereby enter hell, so I did what was better for him. This reply was based on the rule of the Mu'tazila that God must do what is of benefit to the individual. In response to this, Al-Ash'ari said, what if the second brother said, why did you not make me die young, so as to have avoided disobeying you and consequently going to hell? How would God answer that? This question so dumbfounded Al-Jubai that he remained silent, unable to respond. So Al-Jubai became silent, and Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari went home. He went into seclusion, and then after a few weeks he came back into the public, attended the Friday prayer, ascended the pulpit, the mimbar, and announced that he had left the Mu'tazila and adopted the creed of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. He adopted the Sunni creed because the Sunnis were able to respond to these objections. The Mu'tazila, they claimed to be rational, but whenever they became stuck with a question, they would reformulate their creed. While the Sunnis, they kept their creed the same, but they were able to counteract any arguments against the creed. Section 1.12, which is on page 36, is a reference to the modern era. The modern era, the era that we live in now. How Islam responds to the modern era. And the quote from Gladstone is mentioned in this section. The quote from Gladstone, Prime Minister Gladstone. But I make reference to Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis, younger contemporary, a notorious atheist who toward the end of his life adopted deism, the belief in a God who created the universe and then left the universe to its own device. And then he wrote a book, co-authored a book toward the end of his life, that there is a God. His criticisms of Islam specifically, or theism in general, consist of old Mu'tazili arguments. If you read his book that he wrote in his earlier times, you will find that the arguments are outdated, in fact. And he would fall amongst those people who were amongst the old atheists, not the new atheists. But then you have cases in the modern age of a young Saudi woman who fled domestic abuse in Saudi Arabia, took asylum in Canada, and it was all over the news. She refused to board a plane going back to Saudi Arabia in order to avoid domestic abuse. She left Islam due to domestic abuse. And what did I mention? Fake religiosity, cultural beliefs that affect the mindset of young Muslims. So this Saudi family that abused her, they may believe in Islam, but their beliefs are not rooted in a rational understanding of their faith. So the effect of their abuse was that their daughter left Islam. The effect of that domestic abuse. And this is commonplace, that domestic abuse in many religious groups leads young people to leave the faith. So she left the faith and she went to Canada. Now, she gained her freedom. What would you expect the first act of freedom to be? So I mentioned this on page 39, that these arguments can range from the non sequitur to the totally irrelevant. When recently a Saudi woman fled the domestic abuse of her family, and a non sequitur means a reasoning that doesn't follow through. Reasoning that doesn't follow through. After taking asylum in Canada, the headline reads Saudi. So you'd expect, what is the headline? She has escaped domestic abuse. What freedoms will she have? Saudi teen granted asylum in Canada makes the most of her new life, eating bacon for breakfast and grabbing a Starbucks coffee with her legs exposed. Meaning, as if to say, the most freedom can offer is what? Bacon, coffee, and to uncover your legs. So you have sophisticated arguments, but then you have journalistic headlines, the type of headlines you have regarding those who speak against Israel today. Journalistic headlines. So this is the modern age that we live in. The above headline highlights the xenophobic rhetoric being fueled by major news corporations to evoke emotive responses from both sides. Emotive responses from both sides. As well as that, such headlines instill fear in the mind of the reader, illustrating an alien community, meaning illustrating Islam as an alien community or cult which seeks to remove their freedoms. Similar accounts of propaganda were seen in Nazi Germany when Jewish communities were realigned and marginalized from the population to be seen as the common enemy. Isn't this relevant today? Meaning Jewish communities were marginalized in Germany by the Nazis. But today we have people who are Zionist Jews who attempt to marginalize Muslims. And likewise, new atheism. So this passage is, of course, very relevant to today. This recalls another incident where a woman leaves Islam for cultural reasons. Obviously, random cultures like the old Saudi law banning women from driving are to be found mixed in with Islam. Trying to convince her sister to leave Islam, the best proof that she could furnish was, then you can eat whatever you want. In reference to the dietary restrictions of Islamic law, that those dietary laws may be there for our own well-being can hardly impinge on such a proof. So these are the type of proofs. This ongoing war of words alongside the wars on terrorism and counterterrorism are to be found not only in new atheism, but have roots in the religious fanaticism of Charles Martel, the Crusades, and later the imperial powers that developed from the wealth of Muslim Mughal India and Black Africa. The philosophies that are found with this undercurrent may shift, but the same attitude remains. From exporting Christianity to Muslims, blacks and natives of new lands, to the deliberate spread of neoliberal and humanist ideas to the Muslim world, all the while disparaging their entire tradition as inferior, backward, and unfit for the modern world. It is inevitable that what is modern and what is barbaric is determined by the Anglo-European power structure. The attitudes are the same today as they are when the Prime Minister, Gladstone of Britain, is reported to have said in Parliament, holding up a copy of the Quran in his hand, so as long as the Egyptians have got this book with them, we will never be able to enjoy quiet or peace in that land. So this summarizes new atheism in the modern age. Toward the end of this chapter, on 1.13, we have 15 atheistic fallacies. These are 15 atheistic fallacies. These fallacies, in summary, and you can read through the fallacies yourself, generalizing something which is specific. Fallacy number 1. Fallacy number 2, specifying something which is general. So for instance, there may be something general, a rule which is general, and the atheist may commit the fallacy of ascribing specificity to it. For instance, a general prophetic injunction states, do not kill women and children, non-combatants in war. So the fallacy would be, the hadith states that do not kill non-combatants, do not kill women and children. But observing some terrorist organizations killing women and children, the fallacy would be that Muslims permit killing of women and children. This is a fallacy. It goes against the text. Number 3, additions which are not in the original. This is where general statements in the Quran and prophetic statements are added to, creating a fallacy not found in the original statement. Hiding, number 4, fallacy number 4. Hiding conditions and limits which change the context. Fallacy number 5. Using quotes without the previous or following text. Fallacy number 6. Playing with the meaning of the text to establish a point. Fallacy number 7. The strawman fallacy. A well-known fallacy where a presumption is made and then attacked according to the disputant's own devices. Fallacy number 8. Using an isolated aberrant opinion or an anomalous juristic opinion, ijtihad, and applying that to Islam as a whole. Number 9. Using the position of a sect within Islam as the given position of Islam. Number 10. Texts attributed without verification, like the false ascription to Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh that he had the library of Alexandria burnt. This is incorrect. It's not correctly ascribed to Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh. Number 11. Hiding or sheer ignorance of valid texts. Number 12. Science is based upon atheism. It's a fallacy to say science is based upon atheism. Or even to say atheism, the foundations of atheism are based upon science. Number 13. The red herring or the side trimming. This is when one thing is being discussed and the interlocutor brings up something else which is totally irrelevant to the issue at hand. Number 14, appeal to popularity or authority. Like someone says, the Mufti of Saudi Arabia says this, or the Ayatollah of Iran says this. Number 15, the misusing words. So these are 15 fallacies which I placed, which are good for everyone to memorize. Read the examples yourself, and if you have additional questions regarding the fallacies, you bring them up toward the end. Chapter number 2 starts with a quote from Albert Einstein, which is, "When I think of the most able students I have encountered in my teachings, I mean those who have distinguished themselves not only by skill, but by independence of thought, then I must confess that all have had a lively interest in epistemology." So epistemology is the subject matter of chapter 2. The meaning and importance of epistemology. Epistemology, of course, comes from episteme, the Greek word, which is mentioned at the beginning. Which means knowledge in itself. Episteme means knowledge in itself. And what the term epistemology means, how we reach a conclusion, the method of reaching any conclusion. A question here in section 2.2 on page 53. And remember, most people found this chapter the most difficult. This chapter is the most difficult chapter. So today, inshallah, we will have an easy summary. 2.2, does knowledge itself need definition? The answer is no. Why? Because the claim we make is knowledge itself, meaning what knowledge is self-evident. Because if knowledge needed a definition, then every term utilized in that definition would also need a definition. What would that lead to? Continuous regression, ad infinitum. You will never reach a conclusion. If I say to you, knowledge is attaining facts with regard to external reality, someone can object and say, what does the word facts mean? Then I will define facts. Or what does external reality mean? And I will define external reality. Then when I define facts, someone will come along and say, how do you define facts? In your definition of fact, you said the definition is this. This term, how do you define this? And this will carry on ad infinitum, to no end. So Al-Imam Fakhruddin Al-Razi, rahimahullah ta'ala, in his Nihayatul Uqul, fi Dirayatul Usul, which is not mentioned in the book, I purposely left the Arabic references in the bibliography. So the books that were utilized for this book, one of them was Nihayatul Uqul, which is referenced is mentioned in the bibliography. So Al-Imam Fakhruddin Al-Razi points this out, that knowledge itself does not need a definition. Section 2.3, which is page 54, is with regard to judgments. And remember, I said I will simplify this for you today. If you read the book itself, many people found this difficult, the most difficult chapter. Judgments, firstly, what is a judgment? Judgment is affirming or negating something. If I say Zayd is standing, it's affirming. If I say Zayd is not standing, it's negating. Between a subject and the ascription to that subject. Zayd is standing. So this is a judgment. And judgments, remember one important thing here also, is that the atheist will not accept our epistemology without proof. So the purpose of the chapter being detailed and explanatory is in order to convince the reader, the atheist or skeptic reader, with regard to our epistemology. That our epistemology is more watertight and better than the proposed epistemology of the skeptic. The skeptics of the like of David Hume. So, judgments are mentioned in section 2.3. Then in section 2.4, and you can read those segments yourself. Is it clear what judgments are? The affirmation or negation. Then section 2.4 is regarding empirical judgments. Now I'll simplify this again. What are empirical judgments? Empirical judgments are judgments we observe or feel. We observe fire burning, it's an empirical judgment. When someone lights a match and they place a burning match next to paper, what will happen with paper? Paper will burn. So this is an empirical judgment. 2.5 covers rational judgments. But in 2.4 there is a passage which people will find difficult. But I'll make it easy. Some judgments are existence with non-existence. Examples of these. When we eat food, existence of food brings about non-existence of hunger. Yes? That's a judgment. Likewise, the absence of food will bring about hunger. So the absence of something brings about hunger. So an absent being linked to an existent would be like the absence of hunger being linked to the presence of food. An existent being linked to an absent would be like the existence of hunger being linked to the absence of food. So people reading the passage may find this difficult to comprehend. But simply speaking, judgments are when you give an affirmative or negative judgment with regard to any existence. Rational judgments, however, on page 57 and 58, are judgments which are given solely through the mind, without any reference to the external realm. How? Someone may say everything has a reference to the external realm. But the response, some of you may have heard of the novel Hay bin Yaqdhan. Hay bin Yaqdhan was a novel that inspired Robinson Crusoe. The book Robinson Crusoe was inspired by Hay bin Yaqdhan, which is a book, philosophical work. A man on an island. The Hay bin Yaqdhan was with regard to a child growing up on an island without any reference to the external world, how ideas may develop in the mind. But anyhow, the meaning of a rational judgment is a judgment given without any reference to the external realm. Someone may say, how can you have a judgment without any reference to the external realm? This does exist. You have this, for instance, with blind people. A person born blind will not have seen so many things, but he will understand a rational judgment. Even a person who is born blind and deaf, if there was a means of communication, they would understand a rational judgment. So this shows that certain judgments are formed solely with reference to the mind. Like an example of this would be movement and stillness in relation to any material object. A blind person who has never observed something moving or being still will understand something moving and being still at the same time is impossible. If you went to a blind person and you say, can something be moving and still at the same time? A blind person will respond by saying this is impossible. What type of judgment is he giving? A rational judgment, because he has never empirically observed movement or stillness. So this shows the rational judgment exists. There is a third categorization of judgments, which is legal judgments, shari'i, which I didn't cover in the book because it has no relevance to our discussion. And these discussions are summaries of Al-Imam As-Sunusi's, rahimahullah, his works and the works of As-Surqusti, the commentaries of As-Surqusti on the works of Al-Imam As-Sunusi, and other commentaries like Ad-Dusuqi and various other commentaries. Section 2.6 on page 59, categorization of empirical and rational judgments, meaning the number of categories you can make are many that are mentioned throughout this section. Section 2.7 on page 62, certainty and types of proof. Certainty and types of proof. Certainty and types of proof is something which is very important, because when we observe the rational judgments and the empirical judgments, which one of these judgments impart certainty? Which one of these judgments impart doubt? So, on page 65, in section 2.8, I cover proofs that impart certainty. Proofs that impart certainty. And this is, by the way, this entire section, getting onto page 66 onwards, is a summary of Sharh al-Aqaid of Al-Imam Sa'aduddin Umar bin Mas'ud Taftazani, rahimahullah, and the commentaries on his work, like An-Nibras by Abdul Aziz Barharwi, rahimahullah, and other commentaries. Recently, I received Al-Imam Ibrahim al-Bajuri's commentary published for the first time. So this is a summary of the types of proof that impart certainty, which is an interesting. So we are clear on rational judgments and empirical judgments. Why is that important? Why is that important? Why that is important is because knowing rational judgments and knowing empirical judgments and the distinction thereby, a person can respond to scientific objections against miracles, for instance. Because miracles will fall under the rationally possible but empirically rare. Empirically rare. So, if I say to you, for instance, water flows downhill, this is empirically observed. Yes, an empirical judgment. But if I say to you, water flows uphill, you will say this is empirically never observed. But if I ask you, is it rationally possible? If you only had the mind to give a judgment, you will say it's rationally possible that water can flow uphill, but it's never observed. This is the category in which miracles fall into. So miracles are never or very rarely empirically observed, but they are rationally possible. But if I say to you, can you have an object which is moving and still at the same time, your mind will tell you this is rationally impossible. Your mind will tell you this is rationally impossible. Miracles never fall into this category. But if I say, can the divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this discussion is coming in chapter 4, when we discuss, can God create a boulder so huge that He Himself cannot pick up the boulder? This is, of course, a fallacious argument, but the argument is entertained in chapter 4. So when we move into discussions in chapter 5 on science and miracles, and also discussions relating to the philosophical objections to God, it's important we know rational judgments and empirical judgments. So then types of proof, this is very interesting because it's a summary of those works of Ilm al-Kalam like Sharh al-Maqasid of Imam Sa'aduddin al-Taftazani. He wrote al-Maqasid and Sharh al-Maqasid. And likewise, Sharh al-Mawaqif, which is an encyclopedia of Kalam. By Aduddin al-Iji, he wrote al-Mawaqif, and then As-Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani, the author of Nahmir, he wrote a commentary, Sharh al-Mawaqif. This is an encyclopedia of Kalam. So you have a summary of everything in this. Fundamentals. So what are the certainties, fundamentals? Perceptible or observable phenomena, the empirical, the intuitive, mass transmission, and rational propositions. That's 6 in total, 6 things. So the first one, fundamentals, are self-intuitive facts, those things which are understood in of themselves. Like if I say to you, examples, 1 is half of 2. 1 is half of 2. Does this impart certainty? Yes. But there's something else that we must understand at this stage. Each one of these proofs that impart certainty will either be a rational judgment, or an empirical judgment, or a combination of both. So it was important first to present rational judgments and empirical judgments, and then afterwards give the types of proofs that impart certainty. And by understanding those proofs that impart certainty, we understand that they are either rational judgments, empirical judgments, or a combination of both. So if I say to you 1 is half of 2, this is a rational judgment, but it falls under fundamentals. These are fundamentals. Badihi, in Arabic, badihi means these fundamentals. And by the way, this is also found in Arabic logic. So a basic text like Israr Rashid, basic text. The word Israr Rashid is from Greek. But does this mean that Arabic logic was totally Hellenistic in its origin? The answer is no. This is a misnomer. This is a common misunderstanding. Arabic logic adopted Greek logic, but developed and innovated into Hellenistic logic. So the Muslim theologians added Arabic logic into Greek logic. And Arabic logic is from the fitrah, the natural disposition, which relates to the Quran and Sunnah. This is an important point. And you will find this point very useful in discussions, because so many people, they bring up the point that how can we use logic when logic is a Greek tool, a Greek instrument, an Hellenistic tool, and they believed in man gods and anthropomorphic gods, deities which had anthropomorphic characteristics. They believed in mythology. How can we as Muslims utilize their logic? The response is that Arabic logic incorporated intuition, incorporated Arabic fitrah, natural disposition, into the logic texts, which was in line with the Quran and Sunnah. So the first is fundamentals, like the whole of something is larger than its part, or an object cannot be moving and still at the same time, or no solid body can have 2 distinct colors on the same point at the same time. These are things understood intuitively, fundamentals. The second type, which is perceptible or observable phenomena. An example of this is the sun's rising is perceived by the eyes, or the perception of fire burning. Knowing this by the ability to smell, or an ability to smell a rose or taste honey or hear a sound. Perceptible, meaning through the senses. So this would fall into empirical judgment. The third, the empirical, but this empirical is slightly different. It is the mind and senses observing a phenomenon repeatedly. So note, what's the difference between this and the previous? What's the difference? This is why people find this difficult to understand. The difference is that the previous is solely to do with senses. The second one, the third one, which is mentioned under the heading of the empirical, is a combination of the rational and the empirical. A combination of both. Observing a phenomenon repeatedly until certainty arrives at an empirical judgment, like the conclusion made by scientists that bactericidal antiseptic kills bacteria. So science will fall into this category. So science, according to our epistemology, is a combination of observable facts, empirical observable facts, and the rational judgment, a combination of both. Experimentation. The fourth, the intuitive. Now, this intuitive is different to fundamentals. This intuitive is different to fundamentals. The fundamentals, as I mentioned, like knowing one is half of two, but this intuitive involves intuitive certainty. This needs reading. The paragraph needs reading in order to explain. Intuitive certainty is attained through observation and the senses, as with the empirical, except that the imparting of the certain knowledge is attained quicker and does not require repetition or experimentation, as the observer recognizes it intuitively, that is, by an immediate inference or mental illumination that apprehends the necessary connection between the premises and conclusion of observable things. This is why they find the chapter difficult to understand. But I'll make it easier. The first one was what? Understanding one is half of two. The second one was observable things. The third one was a combination of observable things, like knowing that antibacterial chemicals will kill bacteria. This fourth one is observation of data, but a quick intuition, a quick understanding, as opposed to experimentation. Like someone observes the moon and quickly understands with the mind, after observing the moon, that the moon is reflecting the light of the sun. This is a quick intuition. So this is a fourth category. The fifth category, are there any questions on these four categories so far? Go on.
Do you know this fourth one that you just mentioned, is that subjective? Or like, does that person already have the capability to understand that?
People can argue that it's subjective, and if for argument's sake we accept the subjective nature of this fourth category, it will fall into the previous three categories. And the previous three categories also impart certainty. So the point being here of this discussion is, how do we have data which gives us certainty? That is the main point. So these four impart certainty.
I want to ask, say someone used epistemology to come to the conclusion that someone made a miracle, could we not believe in that then as well? Like, for example, Rasputin or something along those lines, if they use that same epistemology.
Yes, so the claim that Rasputin, and I'm again, Rasputin is referenced in the book also. If you remember, there's a reference to Rasputin also. So how do we respond? That response is made on the claim of Rasputin. So is the claim of Rasputin rational? So Islamically speaking, khawariqul ada, violating the norms, is even ascribed to Dajjal, is even ascribed to charlatans. So violating the norms. But how do we know that violating the norms in those cases is a violating the norms which validates those people or not? Is by their claim. So if the claim must be true. So how do we judge the claim? By resorting to the rationality of the claim. So does God exist? We go back to the rational aspect of that claim. So Rasputin's claims were false. Therefore, if he did violate the norms, which most likely he did not because he was a trickster, even though they had to shoot him numerous times and strangle him and stab him until he died, strangely enough, if we were to believe the Bolshevik accounts of his death. But the claims of Rasputin are judged first. So the fifth category now is what? Mass transmission, which is known as tawatur. So this tawatur, mass transmission, is in reference to mass transmitted facts that are not necessarily rational, nor rationally impossible. Why do we mention that? Because the Chinese or the Eastern nations within India, because Buddha was an Indian, but from India and China and Eastern nations, they will claim that Buddha was divine. Is this mutawatir? The answer is no. Tawatur relates to physical events. Tawatur relates to physical events, not rational judgments. But in fact relate to physical events which are rationally possible even if improbable. Improbable, like divers, there are divers that can dive hundreds of meters down into oceans without the aid of masks, without the aid of oxygen. There have been people who have been buried alive and survived for long hours until the grave was exhumed and the person was alive. So this is improbable, but these events do occur, that have been related by a multitude of people who witnessed the events and related them to other groups of people in turn to an extent which could make it rationally impossible for a conspiracy of collusion. So this would make conspiracy theories go out of the window. That if a physical event happened, meaning tangibly, people observed the event occurring and they related this mass transmission, that would mean the event has been mass transmitted. The sixth is the rational propositions. So the rational propositions is like 4 is an even number. 4 is an even number. That's a rational proposition. Rational propositions cannot be denied. If the proposition is correct, there is no fallacy in the proposition. So these are 6 ways of reaching certainty according to our epistemology. 6 ways of reaching absolute certainty. Disputation, so section 2.9. Disputation based on famous assumption or fallacies. So this following section is covering those things which may impart certainty for other groups, but they do not impart certainty to Muslims. So an example of this is famous assumption or fallacies. Justice is good. Justice is good. Oppression is bad. People commonly accept this. All humans are brothers. And other assertive statements are likely types of argumentation based on a presumed fact. So that presumed fact can be truthful, but it can also be a fallacy. Like in India, if you say slaughtering a cow is bad, amongst Hindus, this would be accepted. Amongst Muslims, this would be rejected. So this is talking about the nature of truth, that the relative nature of truth, that the truth can be relative from one place to another. So in Muslim societies, if you say certain things, they would be accepted as completely truthful. But in other societies, they can be easily rejected. Likewise, 2.10, oratory based on accepted norms. So oratory skills, and interestingly enough, I mentioned Hitler employed his consummate oratory skill in Weimar, Germany, to convince the masses with his misguided ideology, as did Mussolini in Italy. So this, of course, this book was written before the current crisis in Gaza, and the book itself completely refutes the claim that we are anti-Semitic. So oratory skills, someone can have good oratory skills and convince people, misguide people. But oratory skills do not impart certainty. Additionally, in 2.11, poetic license. A person can use poetic language in order to convince people, like saying wine is a ruby, a flowing ruby. I use an example of that effect. Like describing wine as a fluid ruby, which may make an alcoholic indulge further and damage his liver. Meaning it entices the mind. He may like, if I say wine is like Ribena or Vimto, and the person drinks convinced of the good nature of the drink. Or someone who has jaundice, I say to them, honey is a cure, and they eat the honey, but the poetic description of honey at that point is not truthful. Likewise, this poetic language can make that which is good seem bad, like describing medicine as bitter poison, which may convince a sick person to avoid his medication. You say to a sick person, look, medicine is a bitter poison, and therefore he avoids his medicine. You misguide him through poetic language. 2.12 is sophistry, deceitful arguments. Sophistry is deceitful arguments. Now, fallacies fall into sophistry. In Arabic, they refer to sophistry as sophistaiya, from the same root in Greek. But sophistry is in a reference to fallacious arguments. Up to this point, people find this chapter difficult, but I believe I have summarized the chapter in a very good way in comparison to what you read. Is that the case? Yes? So, 2.13 is a story, a love story. I decided to add a love story, especially for the fatwa giving mullahs who may condemn parts of the book. The love story makes a good addition, because literature is a part of our tradition. Even in Dars-e-Nizami, you have Diwan Hammasa, Diwan Mutanabbi, which contain condemnable passages in the strongest of terms. Fatwas are applied to Al-Mutanabbi and Habib bin Aws al-Ta'i, the authors of these Dawaween. So likewise, this story that is placed Love is a fallacy. I'm sorry to tell those lovers in the audience that love itself is a fallacy. So I leave the story to you to read the story in your own time. I'm known not to smile or not to fall in love so easily, so I'll skip the story. 2.13 is a story, a love story, but the sad ending I will leave to you to read, that love in itself is a fallacy. So the story covers various types of fallacies. 2.13. Then on page 86. So the fallacies that are covered in the story are known as material fallacies. Why are these fallacies important? They are important because an argument may have the substance of the argument will be fallacious. So these are known as material fallacies. And the story covers them in a way that a person can read them without exerting the mind. But there are many books written on fallacies. And fallacies can exceed 200, meaning so many various fallacies. And why they're referred to as material fallacies? Because the substance, the material of the argument is fallacious. So, 2.14 on page 86, the importance of common sense and the method of signification. Common sense is an important aspect of argumentation. So signification is something which the Arabs innovated into logic, which is known as dalala. In mantiq, it is known as dalala. And I give a story, an anecdote, two anecdotes or three. One of them is, imagine you are flying in an aeroplane over an ocean, when suddenly an island becomes observable through the aeroplane window. Your aeroplane draws closer to the island and then is flying over the island. You then start observing the island landscape from above. While flying over some hills, you observe writing set out in piles of stone, spelling out SOS. What will that signify for you? And what will you conclude? And most importantly, what will you do about it? Or let's suppose you see carvings of statues made from stone. What will that signify for you? Imagine then for a moment how you will convey to those with you what you think the SOS means or what the carvings entail. Then imagine that one of your listeners disagrees with your conclusion. So signification is a very important aspect of common sense conclusions in theism, in concluding that there is a God. And the counter argument to common sense is atheism. This is why I describe atheism as an assault on the mind. Aside from being an emotional, mental inability, debilitation of the mind, atheism is also an assault on the mind. 2.15, Anglo-European philosophy and its epistemology. So very easily, alhamdulillah, we have gone through this chapter, but when you read the chapter now, the chapter should be easier. When you read this chapter, most people who have read this chapter deem this chapter to be the most difficult within the book. Anglo-European philosophy and its epistemology. Firstly, Western philosophy is a broad subject. So you have interesting philosophers like Immanuel Kant and Bertrand Russell are two that interest me the most. But you have others that people find various philosophers more interesting, like David Hume is also an interesting philosopher. Is a broad subject, yet for our purposes we will only look at a few key concepts in order to appreciate the basis and core discussions relating to atheism. So what I limited Western philosophy to are those things which atheism, so modern atheism, and more specifically new atheism, aside from science, so many of us should and must read popular science works. Those of us without scientific backgrounds should and must read popular science works. It's an imperative. Popular science works by Paul Davies or Roger Penrose, or read Relativity of Albert Einstein with a modern introduction. These books are essential reading because none of them contradict our faith. Popular science does not, science itself does not contradict our faith. Even if you read books on evolution theory, as we will cover toward the end of chapter 4, that evolution theory, if someone has the epistemology well thought out and understood, they will never become confused with human evolution theory with regard to the origins of human beings. They will never become confused because our epistemology places and categorizes all science in its correct place. So the foundations of the claims of modern or new atheism are based on scientific discoveries, which we must also read, and Muslims should also contribute to science, must make an effort to contribute to science, even though Richard Dawkins makes a point of condemning Muslims by saying that not many Muslims have won the Nobel Peace Prize for science. Well, the response is these type of institutions are post-colonial institutions. The Nobel Peace Prize is named after a man who invented dynamites. The man who invented dynamites, the award is referred to as Peace Prize, the award for peace, and he invented dynamites. So we don't necessarily acknowledge all the post-colonial constructs. What I believe is Muslims should contribute to science and establish their own awards for science and advancement. Muslims must make efforts in science and funding science and scientific progression. So, some of the underlying philosophies that I cover: empiricism, the overview of empiricism, and then nominalism. Empiricism, firstly, skepticism is the result of empiricism. Empiricism is what relying on our senses alone. And this is what led David Hume to be a mitigated skeptic. That the only certainty that we can ascertain is that which we ascertain from our senses, empirical facts. What we touch, what we smell, what we see, anything beyond that, he refers to as relation of ideas. Hume refers to as relations of ideas which are also attained, the substance of which is also attained from empirical facts. So this empiricism leads to skepticism, because if you only rely on your senses, then what will happen, you will, in terms of metaphysics, you will fall into doubt with regard to metaphysics. What is metaphysics? What we refer to as ma wara at-tabi'a, that which is beyond the physicality, that which is beyond the physical realm is called metaphysical. So, one of the foundation stones of modern atheism or new atheism is empiricism, relying solely on the sensory perception. Secondly, I wrote in refutation of this way of thinking leads to many difficulties and internal contradictions, especially in regard to the fact that we truly cannot know anything regarding the world with the function of the mind, as John Locke proposed, limited to manipulating and building upon experience. The extreme empiricism of Locke and his successors, Berkeley and Hume, was reined in by Immanuel Kant and later by Wittgenstein in the 20th century. What this is in reference to is that Immanuel Kant, he had a famous work, a huge work and a difficult work to read, the summary of which is that Immanuel Kant, as I mentioned, reined in David Hume's skepticism. Firstly, Immanuel Kant, he says that David Hume awoke him from his slumber. His slumber. Which slumber? The slumber of conformity to mainstream philosophy at that time. But then he reined in David Hume's rejection of the metaphysics. He reined this in by what was described as being similar to what Copernicus did with the model of the universe. So what Copernicus did with the heliocentric model of the universe, they say Immanuel Kant did with philosophy by synthesizing with David Hume's skepticism and the certainty of other philosophers, by synthesizing the two. So this is what I am referring to. Why did Kant do this? Kant had to rein in David Hume's skepticism because the skepticism of David Hume would lead to the rejection of Newtonian physics, for instance. You would have to reject science. If you had skepticism regarding everything, you would leave science also. You would leave the conclusions of science. You would leave all scientific research. So empiricism alone falls flat on its face because it would reject science also. The second philosophy is nominalism. Nominalism is the rejection of universals. And Immanuel Kant accepted universals. Rejected universals. But likewise, many prior to him rejected universals. What are universals? Universals in mantiq, in logic, are referred to as al-maqulu ala kathirina mukhtalifina bil-haqa'iq, which means what? A statement which is said regarding numerous things that are different in their realities. Like if we say animals, the word animals is inclusive of giraffes, elephants, cows, monkeys, all these various creatures. They fall under a universal mental concept known as animals. This is known as a universal. The philosophy of nominalism rejects this. Nominalism rejects universals. They will say, for instance, a mug, for instance, is one mug. This is one mug. There's no conception of a mug or mugness. There is no conception of bookness. This book is unique, one book. But there is no concept of book, meaning as a universal. This is what nominalism is. So because nominalism denies universals, it will ultimately deny syllogisms. So in order for a syllogism is a logical argument composed of premises, propositions, and has a conclusion, a natija. But for a syllogism to be valid, there are universals included in the syllogism. So by nominalism will reject all syllogisms. So you see, empiricism would lead us to reject science, and nominalism would lead us to reject syllogisms that are correct. So this is why nominalism is also false. So I covered this. And then the third one is materialism. Materialism is the view that everything is made of matter. Everything, absolutely everything is matter. This, of course, was refuted with the general relativity. And general relativity confounded the materialists. And materialists today have no basis. In fact, even Karl Marx and the Trotskyites and the Bolsheviks, Lenin and all those individuals from the time of Marx up until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and onwards, they promoted materialism as a philosophy. And this was refuted by Western and Arab philosophers. This was refuted entirely. So, some of them, what they did, I mentioned, this has led to the substitution of matter to anything that can be studied by natural science. So some of them, they reworded materialism. Previously, materialism was just matter, physical matter. But now they say anything that can be studied by science. So this makes it more broad now. And this is a materialistic philosophy as it stands today. So what pitfalls does materialism have? One of the pitfalls of materialism, as I mentioned, is reducing form to matter. This is one of the fallacies in our age where materialism is rampant. I give an example from Jonathan Swift's A Tale of a Tub. Words are nothing but wind, and learning is nothing but words. Therefore, learning is nothing but wind. This is one of the pitfalls of materialism. So if I say words are nothing but wind, because materially they are only wind, and then I say learning is nothing but words, that in effect would mean learning is only what? Wind. So this is one of the pitfalls of materialism. It leads to internal contradiction. Then you have utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is based on the fact that morality that treats human desire, pleasure and satisfaction as the sole element of human good. Utilitarianism expands what? That treats human desire, pleasure and satisfaction as the sole element of human good. Morality is thus dependent on the consequences or outcomes pertaining to human well-being. Meaning if the outcome is good, therefore it is right. Even though they do not accept this regarding God Almighty and the actions of the divine. So if we say to them, human suffering, for instance, will result in goodness, they reject this. But through utilitarian philosophy, any action which leads to human pleasure of the individual, human desire, or satisfaction of as the sole element of human good, they will say is fine. That should be fine. So as long as it's satisfaction or desire for the human being, the result is fine, irrelevant to what the moral and ethical constraints are according to religion or custom. This is what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism, consequently, has many nuanced debates about the precise meaning of human pursuit of pleasure and well-being and the avoidance of pain and suffering. It's a confused philosophy. It does not impart certainty. Utilitarianism does not impart certainty. The last one that is mentioned is logical positivism. Now, logical positivism is also known as linguistic empiricism. And this influenced the Vienna Circle, which is a group of thinkers that were based in Vienna from the 1920s, a group of philosophers. But what is it? Firstly, the principle of verifiability is central to this group. They must verify everything. This means that propositions are meaningful if they are verifiable by sense perception, directly or indirectly, or by the meaning of words and grammatical construct. If the propositions are verified by sense perception, they are classified as synthetically true or false. If they are verified by meaning, then they are classified as analytically true or false. Anything not verified by this method is classed as meaningless, with religious, metaphysical, ethical, and aesthetic things therefore seen as a meaningless by many ascribing to this philosophy. So the philosophy bases itself on empirical things, those things which can be verified empirically, directly or indirectly. Now, this version of logical positivism later came under attack, and by the late 1960s had lost its momentum. A softer, more modified version called analytic philosophy evolved, which contended that the meaning of any proposition is its mode of verification. Now, analytic philosophy is the mainstream philosophy of Western philosophers in universities today. So the type of Western philosophers, as I mentioned, Antony Flew and others, and now you have modern philosophers alive today, most of them will ascribe to analytic philosophy in the West. This mode of verification implies that propositions are either empirically verifiable or tautological or a combination of both. What this means, this end part, is that the syllogisms that we present, they say these are tautologies. We are placing the argument within the premise. So within the premises, we are by sleight of hand giving the conclusion. This is what analytical philosophy states. So this will be refuted in chapter 3 in detail. So this claim, this last claim, will be refuted in chapter 3. So these ways of thinking were clearly influenced by David Hume, who classified all known things as relations of ideas only known by the mind, like algebra, arithmetic, geometry, and every affirmation which is intuitively or demonstrably known, or a second division being that of matters of fact known by sense, observation, and memory of sense observation. Now, from this page, page 93, which links to chapter 3, we will go into, inshallah, chapter 3 after the break, inshallah ta'ala. We will resume at 6:30, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We stopped at page 93 in chapter 2 toward the end. Where I stopped was with regard to what David Hume's classification of knowledge was, firstly, that which is observable, perceptible, and a classification of those things which are empirically observable or tangible, and then a second category of a classification which is known as relations of ideas. So he said any real knowledge that a person may have is of these two categories. Those things which are observable or empirical or tangible, perceptible, and then relations of ideas of those things. So how I explain that these ways of thinking were clearly influenced by David Hume, who classified all known things as relations of ideas only known by the mind, like algebra, arithmetic, geometry. So algebra, arithmetic, geometry, these type of sciences he would refer to as relations of ideas. And every affirmation which is intuitively or demonstrably known, or a second division being that of matters of fact. So matters of fact here refers to that which is empirically known by sense observation and memory of sense observation. So this was the categorization of David Hume of all. So make a clear distinction between our epistemology, which I mentioned, 6 ways of ascertaining facts, and then David Hume, who says ascertaining facts is only done by 2 ways. One is sensory perception or memory of the sensory perception, and secondly, relations of ideas, like mathematics. What Hume termed as relations of ideas, Immanuel Kant would call analytic propositions, and what Hume named matters of fact, Kant named synthetic propositions. In analytic propositions, the predicate is already contained within the subject, while in synthetic propositions it is not. Kant would go one step further, as he divided both synthetic and the analytical propositions into a priori and a posteriori, making 4 propositions in total. So the 2 propositions of Hume were given 2 different names by Immanuel Kant. But then Immanuel Kant made those propositions into 2 categories, a priori and a posteriori. So these Latin terms, if we go back to the index, the glossary, we have a priori, which means knowledge considered to be true without being based on previous experience or observation. The original Latin literally translates as from the previous. A posteriori, knowledge which proceeds from observations or experiences to the deduction of probable causes. The original Latin literally translates as from the latter. So Immanuel Kant then made 2 additional categories of what Hume referred to as relations of ideas or matter of fact. So Kant divided these as synthetic and analytical propositions. Synthetic and analytical. These were the terms he mentions in his book, which was a critique of pure reason. I mean, in his critique, he mentions this, and the book is very dense, a huge tome, but the summary of that is mentioned here. And why is this important? Because we make the distinction between our methodology of ascertaining the truth and the classification of these philosophers. But when we go into chapter 3, this interlinks now. The end of chapter 2 interlinks with chapter 3. So chapter 3 begins with a quote from Catherine Tate, who is the daughter of Bertrand Russell, and she wrote a book, My Father. It's a quote which is mentioned in the beginning of chapter 3. Going into chapter 3, firstly, cause and effect. Now, cause and effect is important because a deductive argument is made from effect to cause by theists. Effect, meaning the known universe, is the effect, and the cause is the divine. So from effect to cause, from the effect that we observe, we deduce that there is a cause. So effect and cause is important. But David Hume cast doubt on the reliance of any assertions we may make from observing cause and effect. So he was a skeptic. So if you observe, for instance, billiard balls, one ball is struck with a cue and then hits another ball, will the effect be that the other ball will move? This does not impart certainty according to the reasoning of David Hume. So cause and effect is something that does not necessarily ascertain certainty or impart certainty. This was very important with regard to his skepticism. So cause and effect that is mentioned here by myself, this is taken from the Sharh al-Kubra of Al-Imam al-Sunusi rahimallahu ta'ala. That cause and effect is 4 types. Firstly, what is mentioned is cause to effect. The effect is deduced from the cause. How? Like if you see fire touch cloth, the cloth will burn. So you see fire touching cloth, you deduce the fact that the cloth will burn. How do you know? Because of previous experiences observing this. But the effect is deduced by the cause. The effect is deduced by the cause. The second is if you observe something charred or burned, and you reach the conclusion that this was burnt. This is now observing effect to cause. The effect to cause. And then the third is if you see water boiling over a flame in a water contained in a cauldron, burning the cauldron on fire, what will happen? The water boiling. The boiling water is one effect while the fire is the cause, allowing the deduction of a second effect, namely that the water is hot. So you observe that the fire is burning under the cauldron, you observe that the water is boiling, therefore you also observe a second effect, which is what? That the water is hot. Fourth example is if I tell you Zayd is learned, or Zayd has knowledge, you will deduce the fact that Zayd is learned. Yes? So this is mentioned, but I don't give an example. An example of the fourth type would be like knowing that you could deduce the knowledge that someone else has. But I never gave an example. The example would be if I said, Zayd has knowledge, therefore you will deduce that Zayd is learned. Or if I say Zayd is learned, you will deduce that Zayd has knowledge. So these are four deductive arguments of either cause to effect, effect to cause, or cause to two effects, or deducing one thing by another, which is the fourth type. So which type, when we say there is a creator of the universe, there is a God, the one who has originated the universe, which type of deduction are we utilizing? The answer is that they would employ only the second and fourth type of deduction mentioned above. The second and the fourth. But when David Hume casts his skepticism with regard to cause and effect, he is referring to cause to effect, not effect to cause. Cause to effect. Meaning there's no certainty with regard to deducing a conclusion from cause to effect, but there is certainty when you deduce something from effect to cause. Like if you observe clouds, you say these clouds are bearing rain, it will rain. That is cause to effect. Then later it doesn't rain, because the sun comes out and the sun disperses all the clouds. So there's no certainty with regard to your deduction. But if you see water on the ground all over, everywhere, puddles, what will you deduce? That it has been raining, because there's puddles. So if from effect to cause is certainty. From effect to cause is certainty. So when theologians say that from the effect of everything, they deduce that there is a cause, this is certainty. But they don't say from the cause we deduce the effect. But David Hume, when he refutes and casts aspersions with regard to the certainty of any conclusion, human conclusion with regard to cause to effect, he's refuting cause to effect, not effect to cause. So the next part, which is 3.2 on page 98, the skeptical fetters of David Hume. Now this is an interesting discussion. Traditionally, Muslim rational theologians of the Sunni Kalam method locked horns with the extreme skeptics, for whom they gave the Arabic name Sufasta'iyya. Sophistry comes from the same root, and from whom blossomed three opposing schools: the Inadiyya, the Indiyya, and the La Adriyya. So there is a detail with regard to each school, and also further down how David Hume, the link between David Hume and the Greek skeptics, So the Muslim theologians refuted Greek skepticism, but David Hume was influenced by those Greek skeptics. This is, of course, a long discussion, and it goes up to page 106. But I believe I've given you the conclusion. The conclusion has been given, which is with regard to deducing from effect to cause rather than cause to effect. But the discussion itself is an interesting discussion which you should read individually, and inshallah, if there is additional questions, you can ask at the end. 3.3, which is on page 106. Firstly, even short works like the work of Imam Ibrahim al-Bajuri rahimahullah, when he gives the proof for God, he says, وُجُودُ هَذِي الْمَخْلُوقَاتِ, the very existence of makhluqat, the very existence of creation, points out to the existence of a divine creator, which is effect to cause. That dalil is sufficient. That dalil is sufficient. But then you have counter arguments which are presented. Mainly the rest of our discussion is responding to the counter arguments. So some of those counter arguments now will be presented, but there are more detailed arguments we also have for the deductive argument from certainty with regard to the existence of God. But one of those shubuhat, so the word shubuhat, which is obscurities, is a term employed with regard to these doubts which are placed, which the new atheist arguments will generally be categorized as shubuhat. One of those shubuhat is the teapot argument of Russell. So Russell's teapot, this is point 3.3. Russell's teapot is an argument which I give this full citation, so people cannot say he has not given the correct argument of Russell. So the full citation is and referenced also on note 32. So in note 32, the full citation is given from the Collected Papers of Bertrand Russell, volume 2, page 542. And then also he mentions the teapot analogy again, a shorter version, when he says, I ought to call myself an agnostic, but for all practical purposes, I am an atheist. I do not think the existence of the Christian God any more probable than the existence of the gods of Olympus or Valhalla. To take another illustration, nobody can prove that there is not between the earth and Mars a china teapot revolving in an elliptical orbit, but nobody thinks this sufficiently likely to be taken into account in practice. I think the Christian God just as unlikely. Now, the longer passage is cited just before this, but I responded to this. The fallacy in this teapot analogy is the equating of God with the Olympus and Valhalla gods, and the equating of a teapot in an elliptical orbit between Earth and Mars with the existence of God. Russell, coming from a Christian background, qualifies the word God with the Christian, forestalling some acute differences between Islam and Christianity, as the latter holds the divinity of a man to be a rational possibility, while in Islam it is an impossibility, meaning a rational impossibility. If you remember the types of judgments. Also, the difference between a cause of the universe that is called God is totally different to a random claim of an orbiting teapot. The former has a rational basis and is not just a haphazard claim. The rational deduction of a first cause that is self-sufficient and eternal is an argument deduced from effect to cause and a host of other proofs that cumulatively make the argument for God, which is incomparable with the teapot or any similar claims. The assimilation of God with other gods is also a false analogy, since God bears no similarity to creation in any way, having no anthropomorphic nature that would entail contingency, and anything contingent cannot be God. So this fallacy is mentioned, and then I mentioned also, before proceeding into the argument with regard to the existence of God Almighty, it is essential that the atheist be familiar with the divine attributes. Because the teapot analogy of Bertrand Russell falls into false analogy, disanalogy, what is known as al-qiyas ma'al-fariq, which is an analogy with a distinction, that to say that he can make the argument that a teapot exists that is in an elliptical orbit, or any such type of argument, is not bearing in mind the broad distinction between God Almighty and anything else which has anthropomorphic or attributes of contingency. So in the following sections I mentioned the divine attributes, but at one point where Bertrand Russell states, many orthodox people speak as though it were the business of skeptics to disprove received dogmas rather than of dogmatists to prove them. This, of course, a mistake. And I state Russell is correct here. It is not the task of skeptics to disprove any dogma, but it is the task of theists to furnish valid proofs for the existence of God. So this is a point of agreement, that theists must prove God. So what is that we are setting out to prove aside from the existence of God? So when we attempt to prove the existence of God, it's essential to know the divine attributes of God Almighty. So the 20 attributes necessarily true of God, but more specifically Allah, as the word Allah is more precise in its import, are, and I mentioned the 20 divine attributes which are known in classical Sunni theology, which are existence, not beginning, not ending, self-subsistence, meaning not needing any place or determinant to exist, the aseity of God, dissimilarity to created things, uniqueness, meaning having no partner in his entity, attributes or actions, etc., omnipotence, will, knowledge, life, hearing, sight, speech, such that he is almighty, all-willing, all-knowing, living, all-hearing, all-seeing, and speaking through his attributes of power, speaking through his attributes of power, will, knowledge, life, hearing, sight, and speech, not merely through his being. The 20 attributes necessarily impossible of Allah are the opposites of the previous 20, such as non-existence, beginning, ending, and so on. The one attribute merely possible of Allah is that he may create or destroy anything possible. So before setting out to prove God, or before setting out to disprove our arguments, it is essential that the atheist realize, or the skeptic realize, what attributes are we affirming for God Almighty. It's essential to know these attributes. These are the divine attributes. And you cannot counteract our arguments or our proofs with fallacies like the teapot fallacy of Bertrand Russell. Reasoning from effect to cause that God certainly exists. So now this is reasoning with regard to the universe being taken as an effect. The universe is an effect. From the universe, which is an effect, we deduce the argument that there is a cause for this universe. So this passage, 3.4, page 110, is a very detailed passage. But the entire proof is built upon 7 principles. How many principles? 7. These principles are outlined by the likes of Al-Imam Ibrahim al-Bajuri, rahimahullah, in his Sharh al-Jawhara, Al-Imam Sunusi. Al-Imam Sunusi famously said, anyone who knows these 7 principles closes the 7 doors of Jahannam for himself. Meaning the importance of these 7 principles. Those 7 principles I utilize in the argument in 3.4 without specifying the principles. But then in 3.5, I have a heading 7 principles, and then in 3.6, I have the summary of proof for these 7 principles. So rather than just asserting the principles, there is also a proof for the principles, rather than just asserting. So what the argument in 3.4 firstly, this proof starts from the very contingent nature of the universe. The universe itself is contingent. The contingent nature of the universe is understood from its very observance. And then the meaning of how contingents become established within bodies comes from the fact that their placement is continuous with that of those solid bodies. So all of these passages are built upon the 7 principles. So we will cover firstly the 7 principles. The first principle is what? Establishing something additional existing to the solids, which is everything in the universe that is observed exists with something additional to itself. This is the first principle. Everything that exists in the universe exists with something additional to itself. So, how I mention this part, the first principle, that of an additional existence to the material universe and its components, is self-explanatory. As every rational being feels additional things to his own material body and the observation of the accidents. So anything that we observe has something additional to itself. The second principle, that those accidents which are additional to the material universe are not self-established, meaning it is impossible to have a characteristic without the host being described. You cannot have movement without the mover. So, for instance, you observe planets moving. Principle number 1, the planet exists with something additional to itself. Principle number 1. How does it exist with something additional to itself? Movement, for instance. Principle number 2. The addition that exists with that subject cannot exist without the subject. Like movement cannot exist without the planet. You need a planet for the concept of movement to exist. Is principle 1 and 2 clear? Yes? Principle number 3. This accidental cannot transfer from one material thing to another. So you cannot have the movement of the earth transferring itself to Mars. That's principle number 3. Principle number 4. The accidental cannot be concealed and then reappear. You cannot say, if the planet Earth goes still, you cannot say movement has hid itself, has concealed itself, And then if this earth continues moving, you say, oh, movement hid itself and then reappeared. Is this possible? The answer is no. Movement has stopped, has disappeared. But you cannot say it conceals itself and then reappears. Is this fourth principle clear? Yes? Fifth principle. The fifth principle is that anything eternal does not accept perishing. Anything that's eternal will not accept perishing. Sixth principle. The material universe and all the bodies within the material universe are never void of any accident. Everything in the universe will have something accidental. Will have something what? To explain the term accidental, what do we mean? Like moving or being still. Stillness is accidental, or moving, or color. Every material body, even light is still a material body. When we utilize the term material, do not think it's material is only that which we can grasp with our hands. Anything that exists is material. Even the ruh is material, but we cannot physically handle the ruh. But the ruh does exist. It has an existence. Therefore, every material body has something accidental to its nature. Principle number 7 is that contingents with no first cannot exist, because each component and individual of the everlasting chain of contingents would have a beginning. This individual beginning within the supposed endless chain would mean that the entire chain has a beginning from eternity. For if we had in the external realm a continuous chain of material contingents eternally from the past up to the present, the sum total of those contingents would need an initiator, because the entire chain is possible, which means its non-existence and existence are within the realm of possibilities that require an initiator to bring it into existence. What this means, anything which is contingent like movement cannot have existed forever. Like the planet Earth has not been rotating around the sun forever. There was a time when this initiated, the movement started. So everything that is contingent has a beginning point. If it did not, then the chain would continue. But a contingent chain cannot continue. A regress of contingents cannot continue. Now, upon those 7 principles, the argument that is mentioned in 3.4, if you read 3.4, and then you read 3.5, and you read 3.6, all of these are interlinked. But with regard to this, the entire universe is contingent, and we observe the fact, because someone may say, we observe a part of the universe, how do we know the whole is not eternal? The response is very clear. With certainty, without even observing the entire universe, we know that the universe has an accidental nature. With certainty, that the entire universe has an accidental nature. Why? Because the universe is either moving or still. One of the two. You can say that with certainty. And moving or being still is a contingent nature, an accidental nature, and therefore the universe must have a beginning. And the universe that we observe is in effect, and the effect has a cause, and the cause must be eternal, otherwise it leads to continuous regression. So 3.7 on page 116 is the proof by way of tallying or application. Burhanu tatbiq. This is to show and demonstrate that you can never have continuous regression of contingents. You can never have continuous regression of contingents. What do we mean by continuous regression? a non-ending cycle eternally, ad infinitum, going on and on and on, of what? Contingents. What do we mean by contingents? Accidental things, things which are dependent. If you go back to the 7 principles, what was a contingent? That which exists additional to the subject. Like our being still, or our movement, or speaking, or listening, these are additional things to our very existence. So these contingents can never exist independently, and you can never have a continuous regression of contingents. So what is the logical proof for this? There is a proof which is known as Burhanu Tatbiq. Burhanu Tatbiq is mentioned in many Kalam books. Ibn Sina has his own version, but I do not rely on Ibn Sina because being a Sunni, we rely on more of the Sunni works like Imam Ghazali and the classical Sunni position and how they give an exposition of this. But Burhanu Tatbiq is from amongst the Barahin, the multiple proofs that are presented in the works of Kalam. Firstly, Burhanu Tatbiq is a thought experiment, an experiment of the mind, by way of tallying. That if you tally which two sequences, so a continuous sequence from eternality, from infinity, and you get to the end point, and we refer to the end point as Z. And then you have a second continuous chain of, let's use the example of a library, an eternal library. What do we mean by eternal library? If you go, the shelf goes forever, has no beginning. You get to the last book, we will call the last book Book Z. And for our American audience, Book Z. And then you have a second shelf which also goes on for eternality, forever. And we have the last book is referred to as Book Y. Book Y. So what we do is we do tatbiq, which is tallying. You tally Book Y to Book Y in bookshelf number 1, then you go back to Book X, you tally Book X with Book X, book from bookshelf 1, you tally the book with bookshelf 2. You continue doing this. So every point in sequence 1 is tallied with every point in sequence 2. Now there's an objection here. Someone will say this cannot be done in the physical realm. But the response to this is simply that this is a mental exercise, a thought experiment. And it's done by way of summary in the mind. So you imagine an eternal line. Once every point of sequence 1 has been tallied with sequence 2, this would mean that the increased is equal to the decreased. What does this point mean? So bookshelf number 1, we have tallied every book with on bookshelf number 2. But there's one additional book in bookshelf 1. Which one was that? Book Z. So there's one additional book Z. But we said both of these are eternal. And eternals must be equal. So if the universe is eternal, the material in the universe, there is always addition. But in this case, if you have one addition in two eternal things, if you have one addition, this would mean that one of them is not eternal. Which one? The bookshelf number 2 is not eternal. So the increase in our experiment is only by point Z. If it was supposed that the increased sequence 1 was equal to the decreased, which is sequence 2, it would be validating the rationally impossible. Since we know that the whole is always greater than the part. So Some might say that an increase or a decrease, this is, by the way, I'm reading from page 117. Some might say that an increase or decrease are unique qualities of that something which ends, but it can be responded to by saying that this increase and decrease is from one end and not at both ends of the sequence. The increase in our experiment is only by point Z. If it was supposed that the increased sequence 1 was equal to the decreased, which is sequence 2, it would be validating the rationally impossible, since we know that the whole is always greater than the part. Some could claim that the tallying of two sequences and their points is not necessarily accomplished because of the near equal size of the two sequences, but rather because both of them are endless. The response would be that we definitely know that both sequences are either equal or different in size, and the sequence with less numbers will always finish first. So bookshelf 2 has finished because it has less than bookshelf number 1. Even if each point is not tallied, and in this case we have sequence 2 finishing before sequence 1, when something is found in sequence 1, in this case Z, which does not have anything to be tallied with within sequence 2, it would mean that sequence 2 has finished. So the second bookshelf has finished. Why? Because we tallied all the books up to point Z. There was nothing to tally with book Z. So that means one bookshelf is finished. The last paragraph, the fact that sequence 2 finishes means that it is not eternal. So bookshelf 2 cannot be eternal. Why? Because it's finished. But more importantly, it would mean that sequence 1 also comes to an end because sequence 1 has a limited increase to sequence 2. So bookshelf number 2 has only one additional book to bookshelf number 2. And what would that mean? And that limited increase is the point Z. So it has been decisively proven that sequence 2 is not eternal, and neither is sequence 1, as it only increases upon sequence 2 by Z. So this is known as Burhanut Tatbiq. And William Lane Craig, he of course took this argument from the books of Kalam, while my argument is not a regurgitation of how William Lane Craig formulated the argument. It's taken from the actual Kalam books. If you check Abdul Aziz Parharwi's formulation of the argument and you compare it with what I have written in An-Nibras. So this shows that the contingent can never continuously regress, eternally regress, the contingent. And this has been proven by Burhanut Tatbiq. Now at this point, there is a mention of Cantor's set theory. Cantor's set theory, which is with regard to numbers and eternality in numbers. You can read this yourself. This is on page 118.3.8. And the response is very simple, which I will summarize. As for what Cantor termed as sets, they are constructs of the mind that do not actually exist extramentally. So you can imagine something being eternal in the mind, but it does not exist extramentally. In the eternal realm, there is no physical or external, rather than saying physical, there is no external in the material world that we live in, there in the contingent world. There is no contingent that is endless. Every contingent in the material world comes to an end. So this is a response to Cantor's set theory. And set theory is, those of you who study mathematics will be familiar with this with regard to Cantor's set theory. This is a response to an objection to Burhanut Tatbiq. So you can read this for yourself. In 3.9, I covered the absurdity of circular reasoning and continuous regression. Circular reasoning and continuous regression are two fallacies. which are very important to understand, because many of the atheist objections will have the fallacy of continuous regression, like the common question, if God created everything, then who created God? What's the fallacy in this? That the question is pointing to continuous regression. And continuous regression of contingent bodies is an absurdity and absolutely impossible, intrinsically impossible. You can never have a continuous regression of contingent things. There would have to come a point where the person would have to admit that there was an initiation from a self-sufficient cause of all contingent beings. So this passage on 3.9 covers the absurdity of circular reasoning and continuous regression. That you can never have a continuous regression of contingents. This is also important to highlight, that sometimes people do not qualify the impossibility of continuous regression with contingency. They must qualify this, that you can never have a continuous regression of contingencies, because otherwise they will say, how can you have if continuous regression is impossible, why do you have an eternal God? The response is, the eternal nature of God is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the self-sufficient cause. He is not contingent. Also, circular reasoning is a rational impossibility if it were proposed that A caused B and B also caused A. So if you said A caused B and B caused A, this is of course rationally impossible. This is different to another type of circular reasoning. If I say Bakr is the father of Zayd and Zayd is the son of Bakr, therefore without Bakr there would be no Zayd, the son. The son would not be a son without the father, and the father would not be a father without the son. This is circular reasoning that's allowed. Different to saying A caused B and then B caused A at the same time. This circular reasoning is impossible. Like the Greek snake that eats itself. What's the name of the snake? There's a name, Greek name for the snake. So, I mention at this point, these two principles are known as Dawr and Tasalsul. Dawr is circular reasoning, Tasalsul is continuous regression. So I mentioned Stephen Hawking and the grand design, a reference to him, and M theory, and you can read that yourself with regard to M theory. What the cause of the universe entails, so 3.10 now, on page 122. So once it's been demonstrated and elucidated clearly that from effect we can deduce a cause of the universe, what the cause of the universe entails. So I've placed an additional syllogism. The universe exists after it had not existed. What do you have for premise number 2? Read it out.
Every existence after prior non-existence has an originator that brings it into existence.
And premise number 3?
The conclusion, therefore, the universe had an originator that brought it into existence.
Okay, so the universe exists after it had not existed. Every contingent existent after prior non-existent existence, so I add the clause contingent, yes, has an originator that brings it into existence. Therefore, the universe had an originator that brought it into existence. And on the next page, there is another syllogistic reasoning. If the creator of the universe did not exist by necessity, there would be no universe in existence. However, the universe does exist. Therefore, a creator is necessarily existent. The atheist philosophers object to this by saying these are tautological syllogisms. Tautological arguments are where you, by sleight of hand, you've placed the result within the syllogisms, and I've actually responded to that within the book, so you can refer to the response to that. So, on page 126, there is another syllogism. One's very being has been specified with certain things from a host of numerous other possibilities. Anything which is specified would mean the one who specified it has a will. The conclusion would be that the one who subjects your very being to those specifics is the doer of his choice. Yes? A third syllogism. Okay, these are various syllogistic arguments or deductions with regard to the very existence of God. Then we move on to Lawrence Krauss, A Universe from Nothing. So Lawrence Krauss is a former associate of Richard Dawkins, who fell out with Richard Dawkins after his allegations made against him in Arizona University and his subsequent retirement from Arizona University. He has a book with the name A Universe from Nothing. Now, I'll give you a summary of this. Charles Darwin's book On the Origin of Species was a classic, science classic, that was a watershed book in the sense that it broke common conceptions with regard to human origins. So Richard Dawkins has an afterword in Lawrence Krauss' work, A Universe from Nothing, in which he compares Lawrence's work with that of Charles Darwin, saying the way On the Origin of Species was a classical for biology, this book, meaning the book of Lawrence Krauss, is a classic for physics. And physics is, of course, dominates all of science, is more broad than just biology. So, of course, the book itself is based upon, so this is what Richard Dawkins actually wrote. Even the last remaining trump card of the theologian, why is there something rather than nothing, shrivels up before your eyes as you read these pages. If On the Origin of Species was biology's deadliest blow to supernaturalism, and they refer to religion as supernaturalism, we may come to see a universe from nothing as the equivalent from cosmology. The title means exactly what it says, and what it says is devastating. But what does it say? So let's look at this book, and in fact, Muslims have nothing to worry about. I would encourage reading these books. There's nothing that actually threatens the iman of a person in the book of Lawrence Krauss. If a person is well trained, has read this book, understood this book, the book proposes a universe from nothing. And Richard Dawkins tells us the title means exactly what it says. But does it? It doesn't. Because when you read the book, Lawrence Krauss does not mean absolutely nothing. So when philosophers and theologians say nothing, they mean absolute nothingness. So Lawrence Krauss in post interviews after he had written the work, he claims he does not need to mean by nothing what the philosophers and the theologians state. But the argument of the philosophers and the theologians is from absolute nothingness, not from what he claims. For instance, Lawrence Krauss, his chapter 9 is entitled, so you read this book, you go through the painstaking patience of reading through his work, and you reach chapter 9, and it reads, nothing is something. Nothing is actually something. So all through the work, you are told that nothingness is actually something. And you can read what I've written with regard to that. Laws in and of themselves are regarded as descriptions of the underlying materials of the universe, whether those considered are as electromagnetic fields or material particles. Relativistic quantum field theories do not count material particles as the elemental physical stuff of the world, but as arrangements within the field, etc. Read everything that I have written. You will realize that when Lawrence Krauss says a universe from nothing, he does not mean absolute nothingness. There was something, and from which something came. So it goes back into the argument that that something which existed was also contingent in nature. So we go back to the original argument that contingency cannot go on for eternality. 3.12 is, the heading is Afterthoughts and Various Considerations. So these are considerations when I think over a few things which you should read for yourself. And then 3.13 is Occam's razor. Occam's razor, and so the reason for presenting Occam's razor here is because I say the second method by which atheism masks its assault and denigration of human reasoning is by utilizing unfamiliar terms to a lay audience, or by obfuscating its arguments, meaning simple arguments, presenting them in an elaborate manner. So people who are unfamiliar with terminology, they will find those arguments, they will deem those arguments as being very intelligent. This is why I left a glossary of terms. So if you memorize the glossary of terms, and you memorize all the terms that you find in this book, in fact, you will not find any atheist arguments very difficult to handle. Occam's razor is a principle that is also known as the principle of parsimony, which is the most simple explanation is the best explanation. And then I also mentioned Leibniz's principle, the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz is the grand teacher of whom, what we refer to as Dada Ustaz, the grand teacher of Immanuel Kant. So Leibniz is from the rationalistic group of philosophers, and Immanuel Kant is more innovative and more original than Leibniz. So Leibniz has a principle, the principle of sufficient reason, which Leibniz states, there can be found no fact that is true or existent, or any true proposition, without there being a sufficient reason for its being so and not otherwise, although we cannot know those reasons in most cases. Now, why I mentioned Occam's razor and the principle of parsimony is because these are common sense principles. But atheists would deny these principles. So this is why I mentioned these are assaults on the reason. So 3.15 is on page 132, the fallacy of composition. This is another response to Bertrand Russell. So, what is the objection? And this objection was brought up by Russell in his debate, which was aired on the BBC with Copleston. In that debate, and both Bertrand Russell and Hume, David Hume, both of them make this argument in separate places, which is known as the fallacy of composition. Now, the fallacy of composition is worded in such a way this team comprises of strong athletes, and therefore the team is strong. So this one is from the part to the whole, from the juz to the kull, from the juz to the kull, part to the whole. But then you have from the whole to the part, like saying this rope is strong and therefore every strand is strong. False. So this is known as the fallacy of composition. So what Bertrand Russell said is, by you saying the universe is contingent, then you say, how do you know the universe is contingent? You say, we observe the known universe and we know it's contingent. When we observe the universe, we know it's contingent because we observe a part of the universe. So he says this is a fallacy. The cosmological argument is falling into a fallacy. What is that fallacy? That how will you deduce from the part to the whole? I've already answered this. If you go back to the 7 principles, the 7 principles in fact answer this. But that is how the argument is worded. But the fallacious nature of this argument is similar to the following. This aeroplane is made of small bits of metal. Therefore, the aeroplane is small. But a correct argument would be, this aeroplane is made from metal. Therefore, the aeroplane is metal. So if I say the universe is made from contingencies, therefore the universe is contingent, it's not a fallacy of composition. A fallacy of composition would be if I had said the aeroplane is made of small bits of metal, therefore the aeroplane is small. But it's not a fallacy of composition if I say the aeroplane is made from bits of metal, therefore the aeroplane is metal. So for more detail, read that passage. In 3.16, a caused universe and the causal principle. And 3.17, the anthropic principle and the teleological argument. In 3.18, God of the gaps. Now, God of the gaps is a famous fallacy mentioned by atheists. What is that fallacy? Some theists may fall into this fallacy sometimes when we do not have a scientific answer for something, and by saying it is the way it is because God created it and made it so. Now, why is this a fallacy? If you present that as a scientific explanation, it does not fall under the rubric of science. So if any religious person attempts to make a scientific theory by stating God has made it so, that would be a fallacy as a scientific theory. Because what is science, as will be explained in chapter 4, is that science explains nature and phenomena that we observe around us, how it functions, how it integrates, the integrated complexity of nature. But by saying God created it as such is not a scientific explanation. So if Muslims or theologians or theists in general refer to God for science, this would be a fallacy. So the God of the gaps fallacy is mentioned here, that we do not approve of where science has, those fields of science which have not been uncovered, proposing God as a scientific theory. But then it moves on to a very interesting part, alien of the gaps. Alien of the gaps is in reference to Richard Dawkins' premise of a possibility that aliens placed the first life form on earth. Now, because of a lack of time, we will finish here, but I'm sure I've encouraged you to read the rest of the book, inshallah. because the rest of the book is easier and we've covered the most difficult discussions in the book. So inshallah, the purpose of such type of gatherings is to encourage reading amongst our people. And inshallah, after the salah, we will have questions and answers, an open questions and answers session, inshallah. So I do dua that you bother to read the entire book. Those who listen to the recording, that after listening to this recording, we did nearly half the book, but we did the most difficult discussion. So if you listen to the recording, you will find the most difficult discussions very easy to understand by way of summary, by which I have given you the summary of even the most difficult passages of this book. And I believe new atheists, those of them who are still around, like Richard Dawkins and others, will be unable to adequately respond to this book. There is a response to Stephen Fry in chapter 4. So all of chapter 4 is a response to Stephen Fry's assertions on evil and the imperfect universe created by God, or as he claims, that if there was a God, he would be absolutely evil. So the response to that is in chapter 4 on free will and so many other difficult questions. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this book a source of success and removing doubt from the hearts of Muslims and non-Muslims, insha'Allah ta'ala. Jazallahu anna Sayyidina Muhammadan sallallahu alayhi wa sallam ma huwa ahluh. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.